The man was originally a corporate drone programmer who worked 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., constantly chased by KPIs. Yet after one sleep, he transmigrated into a useless young master who only knew how to eat, drink, and have fun. But it was precisely someone like this who would, in the future, raise the 5 great sinful villainous antagonists capable of destroying the world. And the reason he did so was only because he didn't want the peaceful and happy everyday life in front of him to collapse. Leaping from a modern-day wage slave to the son of a count was basically like pie falling from the sky. But right after transmigrating, he discovered something terrifying. He couldn't even read the book. Weren't you supposed to automatically understand the writing when you transmigrated to another world? A nearby servant quietly reminded him, "Young master, you're holding the book upside down." So it turned out the original owner of this body was a completely ignorant, useless young master. The exceptionally lavish dinner made him so excited he could barely contain himself. This was nothing like that corporate drone life where he was starving all the time. And what's more, there was even a maid thoughtfully providing a bedtime bathing service. Just like that, he became a young master of absolutely no use, spending all day eating and having fun. As for where this was, he was actually completely clueless himself. Not until the maid attending him suddenly spoke, "Young master, your elder brothers will be back tomorrow. Please be sure to rest early." That line made him a little uneasy. The maid added, "It's young master Leo and young master Tonio. What's wrong with you today? Why do you seem like you don't know the Palacio family?" The Palacio family. The moment that name appeared, a strong sense of foreboding surged up in his heart. The more he thought about it, the more familiar it felt. This place, could it be Psychedelia? So-called Psychedelia was the job change RPG he used to crazily grind in whatever spare time he had back when he was a corporate drone. But the game had a nightmare setting. No matter which route you started from, once the 5 great sins appeared, the game would end immediately, because they would reduce everything to ashes. And the Palacio family was a noble house that appeared in a side quest before the main storyline began. After figuring out where he was, he felt like his whole world was falling apart. He simply couldn't understand why he had to transmigrate into the very first country destroyed by the 5 great sins, and even become the 3rd son of Count Palacio, Alan Palacio. In that instant, he even started to miss his old 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. corporate drone life. This was clearly a life that could only be stable and wealthy for 10 years. This feeling was worse than having half a year of wages withheld by a boss. Just as he was complaining that transmigrators don't get a single benefit or cheap power, Alan suddenly realized what he knew was the plot 10 years later. Wouldn't that mean he had the future in his hands? Since he knew how the world would be destroyed, he just had to snuff out the causes in advance. In order to protect this hard-won peaceful life of noble comfort, he made up his mind. He would go and reform the future 5 great sins. 2 months later, Alan's personal knight Evan came to report. "We've rescued all the orphans from the live experimentation lab in the east. The orphanage's operating rights have been handed over to a girl among them named Yusha." After hearing the report, Alan nodded in approval. "As expected of the person I picked, you're very capable." However, Evan was a bit confused. "Is that praise? I can't really tell from your expression." Alan simply put on an exaggerated smile. "Anyway, Evan, I'll be counting on you from now on as well." This face was originally able to naturally express emotions, but now he was completely unable to properly control his facial muscles. Evan was a knight known for loyalty in this betrayal-ridden Psychedelia. The moment Alan discovered such a treasure-level talent, he recruited him without hesitation. Evan pondered for a moment, then voiced his doubt. "This attack was actually to save that girl named Yusha, right? I think I understand why you specifically mentioned her name. From the perspective of someone who has lived the life of a mercenary for a long time, she's very unusual. So strong that I can't understand it. Why she would be so docilely imprisoned there. But why didn't you bring her back? If you do it this way, don't you gain nothing?" Evan was right, but this was actually only one part of Alan's plan. Yusha Blutia, she came from a bizarre monster blood clan. They gained power by signing contracts with an unnameable existence from another world. After enduring a cruel tragedy, she would become the sin of wrath among the 5 great sins, a super monster that would cause hundreds of thousands of casualties. If she could grow up in peace, perhaps she wouldn't take part in that destruction anymore. Alan put on a profound look. Now isn't the time yet. Those words made Evan visibly more tense. Alan continued instructing him. "Don't spread this matter. At the same time, continue providing funding for Yusha. Also, deliver this letter to her." Evan was somewhat surprised. "Young master, you even specifically wrote her a letter? I will deliver it personally." Watching the knight's figure recede into the distance, Alan wasn't sure whether he could really calm that girl down, but he had to try. The seemingly ordinary greetings in the letter actually hid content the game emphasized dozens of times. According to the Archbishop, it was a secret sigil that could soothe the Monster Blood clan, with an effect that could calm people. "The dark night is purgatory, the holy light is grace, and the devout shall return to the Lord's embrace." This line was originally the incantation the Archbishop recited when the Sin of Wrath appeared. Unfortunately, in the game, he recited it too late and the spell failed. But if he delivered these words to her 10 years early, maybe it would still be in time. Stretching lazily, Alan thought, among the 5 great sins, he had dealt with one first, next it was time for the next target. Of course, expecting to build a good relationship with a monster using just a single spell sigil sounded a bit too naive. But since they were a race that worshipped otherworldly existences, maybe it really would work. After all, in the realm of fanatic faith, their way of thinking was something humans couldn't understand at all. At this very moment, Evan, standing before the girl, had long since been intimidated by her magic power, so strong it was nearly twisted. And this strange child seemed to have no emotional fluctuations whatsoever. Under his shocked gaze, the girl slowly spoke. The person who wrote this letter is called Alan, is he? Why didn't he bring me to his side? Why, exactly? The magic power radiating from her made cold sweat pour down Evan's face. You had to know, being able to materialize magic power required at least a Grandmaster level realm. In his tension, he recalled what the young master had said. Now isn't the right time yet. Yusha softly repeated, a promise only the master knows. That tiny change in her emotions made Evan subconsciously tighten his grip on the sword hilt. Immediately after, the girl smiled with a sickly sweetness. I understand what that lord means now. Elsewhere, Alan had already become so utterly addicted to lying flat in his luxurious, easy life that he couldn't pull himself out. As he flipped through materials, he investigated intelligence on the 3rd great sin. Evan reported at this time. The second child you mentioned has already been rescued. Alan asked, did you treat him well? I mean the kind of attitude that's very, very gentle. No sooner had he finished speaking, bang, the study door was kicked open. The one who came was the Count's second son, Tonio. He glanced at Alan with swagger. Yo, isn't this my little brother? Heard you've actually started studying hard lately? A piece of trash. What books are you even reading? Your big brother's talking to you. Why aren't you answering? Alan had only one question left in his mind. How did the original owner even survive? With his current temper, he really wanted to talk back, but he knew he couldn't act rashly. So he simply lowered his head and saluted. Since elder brother needs to use it, then I'll take my leave first. Tonio was just thinking this little brother was pretty sensible, when a dagger suddenly flew past in front of him, and stabbed deeply into the wall. A bunch of cockroaches. What are you chirping about here? Both of you, disappear. I don't want to see blood first thing in the morning. The one speaking was the Count's eldest son, Leo. While the 2 elder brothers glared at each other in a standoff, Alan quietly edged toward the door and crawled away without a sound. In the game, although Count Palacio's household held enormous power, it was the first cannon fodder family to be uprooted by the 5 great sins. And these 2 elder brothers who were currently locked in an irresolvable fight. One was the underworld overlord known as the King of Fresh. One was the drug king who controlled a massive criminal syndicate. To preserve this pleasant everyday life, Alan decided he'd better not provoke them for now. His ideal was simple. To remain a weak, useless young master like this, and live steadily and happily ever after. After returning to his room, Evan mentioned that the second child also didn't look ordinary. He racked his brains, unable to figure it out. This young master who could hardly even protect himself. How on earth did he know about the secret live experimentation site far away and the slave black market? He asked Alan again, should the child we found this time also be sent to the orphanage? Of course, Evan didn't know that this not ordinary child he was talking about actually had the potential to destroy the world. In a united kingdom made up of multiple nations, in the central Kalian kingdom, there existed an underground slave black market. The second boss, Deus Michaelian, after being sold as a slave, repeatedly abused, and passed from hand to hand countless times, would ultimately fall and become the sin of sloth among the 5 great sins. He would use extremely cruel methods to destroy the various kingdoms one after another. Many players feared his tactics. However, unlike the title sloth, he was actually a diligent monster who would repay everything twofold. That was why Alan repeatedly instructed Evan to treat him especially gently. Alan steadied his expression and said flatly, same as before, the time is not yet ripe. Although this letter, too, contained only everyday greetings, Alan quietly slipped in some of his own complaints and true feelings. In the orphanage, this boy covered in wounds looked out of place. At that moment, a strange voice whispered by his ear, you're already broken. These traces were left by that thing, weren't they? But you're actually very lucky. The great moon has already chosen you. Come, feel with me the power that has been bestowed, and release it. Offer all your loyalty entirely to that lord. Then you can take revenge. Go on, gently, greet them a little. And at this moment, Alan was still worrying, where exactly is the 3rd boss? Until Evan rushed over to report, something happened. Second young master is already dead. At the funeral of the second son, Tonio, the Count, with his arms around 2 heavily made-up beauties, complained impatiently. When is this boring funeral going to end? Alan pinched the bridge of his nose in secret. Someone could actually do drugs and bring women to his own son's funeral. This world was way too dark and fantastical. But what was more troublesome was, Tonio had died so early due to a misstep. This didn't match the predetermined manner of death in the game at all. According to the original plot, he was clearly dragged into hell only after a long internal struggle with Leo. Leo now wore a pie fell from the sky expression, the corners of his mouth almost splitting to his ears. The killer could only be him, or his supporters. But none of that mattered to Alan. At this moment, the only thing he cared about was resolving the 5 great sins as soon as possible. A year passed in twists and turns. After the successor issue was settled, Leo took the opportunity to absorb his father's drug business, and the Count's household unexpectedly became more peaceful than ever before. Over the course of that year, Alan and Yusha had already developed into pen pals. In this world, diligently grinding favor would come in handy one day. Through letter after letter, Alan learned that the children were all doing well. Yuna was good at hide and seek. Haydn was proficient at war games. Deus often performed puppet shows for everyone, growing up without a single flaw. But the newly increased sponsorship list made Alan frown. Why is the sponsorship amount for such a small orphanage still rising? At this time, Evan came to report. The Intelligence Guild has already found clues to that child. Alan's spirits lifted. Finally, we've dragged that guy out. What a wonderful and peaceful night this is. Margot, a place where drugs circulated. A bald man was sighing in admiration at the generosity of Palacio's eldest son. Every settlement was extremely lavish. With Leo's money, their organization had expanded to a scale of several hundred people. But when the two of them returned to the base, what met their eyes was corpses all over the ground. Everyone, like puppets gone out of control, had plunged daggers into their own necks, screaming for help with all their might while ending their own lives with their own hands. No matter how they struggled, they couldn't change the ending of death. At that moment, a black-robed figure walked out from the depths of the alley. Today's puppet show was also splendid. The sponsorship list needs another entry. But Deus couldn't understand what meaning such words had. Killing this trash, how does it help with revenge? That person replied blandly. Everything now is to pave the way for waiting for that lord's return. We can't exactly receive him in such a shabby place, can we? Everything is for that lord's will. We, Blue Moon, are that lord's blade. Time once again flew by. Alan had been pen pals with Yusha for 2 years. Dragging his exhausted body, Evan searched all around the manor for the young master, and finally found him in the back courtyard. It turned out the 5th child had also arrived safely at the orphanage. During this period, he had successfully fished all the remaining 3 great sins out of their fated paths. Although it took quite a bit of effort to find the 3rd, the sin of greed, still by relying on his memories of the game and excessively squeezing Evan, Alan ultimately made it through. He said to Evan, "Rest well for the next few days. The tasks on the orphanage side can be considered paused for the time being." Alan himself also felt somewhat dazed. Things had progressed too smoothly. All the bosses in Psychedelia fell into the 5 great sins with miserable pasts as their turning points, and the current point in time was precisely their pasts before they completely broke down. To rescue them all before those critical moments, in theory, it was almost impossible. At the beginning, Alan was even worried. What if, by the time he found them, these people had already broken? He asked Evan, "How is the orphanage doing now?" Evan replied, "Everything is as usual, very smooth. Those children who at first were like broken puppets are much more cheerful now. There's no longer any need to arrange childcare teachers." Alan didn't expect Yusha to run the orphanage so well. Could it be because she originally liked this kind of setup? Looking at the letters in his hand, he suddenly felt that Yusha was actually a very kind person. The letter said, "Everyone is very healthy. Several of the little ones at the orphanage have grown especially well. There's no need to worry about Deus anymore, and the newly arrived children are also living here safely." Alan couldn't help feeling a little proud. The 5 great sins, under my guidance, they can actually grow up so ordinary. At this time, Evan suddenly asked, "When do you plan to go see them? Every time you say you'll see them when the time is right." No one expected it. Alan simply didn't want to see them. Getting along with them would indeed bring quite a few benefits, but the process of them becoming sins was too horrifying. According to the game's plot, these guys already had explosively bad character from childhood. Even if he pulled them back from the edge of the abyss ahead of time this time, Alan still felt somewhat guilty. He could only answer vaguely, probably, 5 years from now. In a dark fantasy world like this, I still need to train up my self-preservation ability first. Luckily, magic requires talent, and this body just happens to be the kind that. Evan suddenly cut in, "Have you heard of Blue Moon? A fairly famous organization recently, specializing in hunting down criminal syndicates." For this name that had never appeared in the game at all, Alan only treated it as some small organization that would get wiped out sooner or later. Seeing that the young master didn't look interested, Evan gestured. "They even dare to kill nobles. I thought you already knew they existed." Alan fell silent for a second. "Starting today, you'll sleep next door to me." Elsewhere, at the orphanage, Yusha was presiding over a meeting. "How are things in the north?" Sin of Pride Seorang spoke up. "I pulled off all the slave traders' heads. They didn't even figure out who I was. I even kindly played a game with them. If they guessed the color of my eyes right, I'd spare their lives. Pity, not a single one got it right." Sin of Greed Rinna followed with her report. All the bodies have already been dealt with and buried cleanly. Sitting at the doorway, Sin of Envy Raiden said lazily. The South is dealt with too. He tore that illegal live experimentation lab, and those annoying, arrogant Avalon bastards, to pieces until not even dregs remained. After hearing everyone's reports, Yusha nodded slightly. Well done. Everything is advancing according to that Lord's will. We exist for the Great Moon. At this time, Deus suddenly spoke. Avalon's leader is the eldest son of the Count's household where that Lord is. When I was cleaning up the South, I found a threatening letter. The Count's eldest son has set his sights on that Lord. The next second, a terrifying aura burst from Yusha, making the two Sins who had joined later tremble uncontrollably. The contents of that letter were very clear. After the Count died, he planned to quietly dispose of Alan. The letter burned to nothing in Yusha's wrathful magic, turning into ash. 2 years later, Count Palatia died. On the surface, the cause was a sudden cardiac arrest. Considering his habit of abusing drugs indiscriminately while alive, everyone knew what the real cause of death was. Leo seemed to care more about Blue Moon's movements than his father's death. No one truly mourned the Count, and the funeral hastily ended in a bleak silence. At this moment, Leo's gaze had already begun to fix on Alan. However, the moment Alan returned to his room, he immediately began packing, and called Evan along too. Facing the knight's baffled expression, he gave an explanation. We're leaving here. Not leaving completely, just moving a bit downward. Evan turned back to confirm. Young master means Rodmill? Alan's plan was simple. Move to the small village in the south of Palacio territory, Rodmill, and live in seclusion. Everything happening now was being watched by Leo from afar. Golden slices of bread, paired with a slightly brown fried egg. This simple breakfast in front of him made Alan truly feel life could actually be so richly varied. However, this leisurely life only lasted 3 days. He was forced back to the Count's household again, and this time, it was to attend the eldest son's funeral. Alan stepped into that blood-stained manor in disbelief. Leo, why did you die so fast? Pierced through the heart by a long sword and killed. Who on earth killed Leo? He couldn't help muttering to himself in a low voice, and the guard beside him was frightened. I just accidentally made eye contact with you, my lord. Alan was even more confused. What exactly were these people afraid of? Just then, Evan seemed to have found the key information, and quickly came to his side. Overnight, the mastermind behind wiping out Avalon. Alan was immediately left speechless. Not long ago, on the day he went to Rodmill, Leo watched the carriage receding into the distance, hesitating over whether to get rid of Alan. According to the original plan, he would act only after their father died. He hadn't expected that brat to proactively apply to go to the border. Maybe I won't even need to do it personally anymore. The recent trouble on Avalon's side had left him in a foul mood, and everyone he looked at annoyed him. Leo ordered his subordinate Alman, go follow that carriage. Alman asked back, should I take care of him while I'm at it? Those words made Leo freeze slightly. Alman, who had always only carried out orders in silence, actually took the initiative to ask a question. He barked irritably, your job is to obey my orders. Before the words even finished, a long sword suddenly pierced through his chest. Leo spoke with difficulty. You dare betray me? Alman, no. Blue Moon member, Haydn, answered calmly. I happen to like war games too. During this time, you let me play to my heart's content. Red Moon taught us a creed. Blue Moon is that Lord's sword. We obey only that Lord's commands. If someone wants to harm the Great Moon, we will erase them in advance. So I've been waiting for you to say that. Who would have thought I'd have to wait a full 2 years? Facing Leo's dying curses and threats, he added another stab. The moment you just said that, Avalon had already disappeared from this continent. What a pity. The Great Moon had originally given you a chance. Just like that, Alan's peaceful, unrestrained life, like a 3-day trial pass, expired on the spot. Even more outrageous, he actually became the mastermind behind wiping out Avalon. Alan instantly fell into deep world weariness. Why did things turn out like this? Evan began analyzing calmly. In this incident, the only person who benefited is you. We had just left the manor when Leo was killed. That way, you have a perfect alibi and naturally become the heir. More importantly, Avalon is gone, so no one can use this matter to target you anymore. You've already become the behind-the-scenes ruler of the Count's household, commanding master-level sword assassins. Faced with this line of reasoning, Alan was momentarily at a loss for words. In the game, no organization had ever been able to do this. He suddenly remembered Blue Moon that Evan had mentioned before. Could it be that bunch? But Evan shook his head to deny it. Doesn't seem like Blue Moon style. Blue Moon leaves a mark with every operation, and Avalon's members were all killed by the sword. That scene could be called hell on earth. Alan thought to himself. Blue Moon never appeared in the game. An organization that looks this weak is probably not the culprit. Then, who did it? Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Yusha asked everyone, did we leave any traces? Rena held up the materials. None at all. Seal Rang shook the dagger in his hand. Only a ground full of corpses. The other two Sins also returned to the team one after another. Avalon's remaining forces totaled 486, and per the boss's orders, all of them were cut in half. The massive organization Avalon, which had once covered the sky with one hand in the kingdom of Asteria, was completely erased from the continent in just 5 days. Haydn suddenly spoke. The cleanup seems not completely over. I found there's still a batch of nobles closely tied to Avalon. The Altia family is quite deeply entangled with Avalon. Yusha was silent for a moment, then voiced the answer they all tacitly understood. You already know what I'm going to say. As she spoke, astonishing magic power surged over every member's body. Then deal with them, silently. Then she asked Rinne again. There's no problem on the Intelligence Guild side, right? Rinne lifted the file in her hand to explain. The Intelligence Guild has already uniformly concluded that this incident has nothing to do with Blue Moon. All the guilds unanimously believe this is merely a hell scene crafted by a swordmaster. On this point, Yusha issued a stern instruction. The Lord must absolutely not be allowed to know. This was an order she had emphasized countless times. Even though this operation wasn't personally ordered by the Lord, who told him to try to kill that Lord on his own? We are a sword, and a sword shouldn't have a will of its own. Blue Moon must act according to orders. Carve that sentence into your heart. That Lord knows everything. Never disappoint him. Clearly possessing overwhelming power, Yusha nonetheless felt anxious and uneasy out of fear that that Lord would discover the truth. Even though she vaguely wavered in her heart, she still repeated firmly, all of this is for the Great Moon. After the funeral ended, Alan was kept busy for a full month. He had originally only wanted to live that kind of noble life of eating, drinking, and having fun. But as both of his brothers died one after another, deviating from the original plot, all of the family's affairs fell onto this newly appointed heir. Alan was nearly going crazy. Those subordinates who used to slack off were now, one by one, brimming with drive. Yet no one knew that, in other people's eyes, the way he worked so desperately was terrifying. Like he was brewing some earth-shaking conspiracy. Quite a few people even secretly calculated that maybe they also had to work a bit harder, so they wouldn't end up being purged by him. Over the flames, the chunks of meat sizzled. Looking at the scene before him, Evan still couldn't calm down. Just by self-studying for 2.5 years, he had reached Tier 2. This kind of magical talent was truly shocking. You had to know, an ordinary person needed at least 4 years of study, plus sufficient natural aptitude, to have a chance of touching this threshold. Without that inborn material, don't even think about using magic. But Alan learned magic not for any grand cause. He only wanted to slightly enhance his ability to protect himself. And to master this skill, the prerequisite was being able to control magical power with extreme precision. But at this half-baked level, just how useful could it really be? He had never even dared to imagine that one day he would use magic on a real otherworld battlefield. When he first started, he really was excited. But now he finally realized, between himself and true powerhouses, there was a gulf that couldn't be bridged. Magical power was something you were born with. Like an athlete's physical conditions, it was already written in stone from the moment you were born. And his amount of magical power, compared with ordinary people, was pitifully small. This kind of gap was something no amount of training could ever catch up on. While he was deep in thought, Evan brought an invitation, an upcoming ball inviting him. So he took Evan with him and went. It was a ball held regularly in the south of the Kingdom of Asteria to promote interaction among nobles. With him about to formally inherit the Count's title, Alan planned to use this opportunity to build good relationships with other nobles. For his future life plan of being peaceful and lying flat, this step was extremely crucial. However, the direction the plot took ran completely counter to his expectations. As soon as he opened his mouth, everyone around him would become extremely tense and avoid him, even failing to maintain the etiquette nobles were supposed to have. This bizarre reaction left Alan stunned on the spot. Still, he was mentally prepared for this kind of situation. Alan simply took it as, they thought he had no taste, so they couldn't be bothered to deal with him. For that, he had prepared thoroughly early on. He planned to use the social skills he had been secretly practicing to turn the situation around. The taste of this red wine is indeed one of a kind. Especially this aroma, it's very special. As he spoke, he revealed a practiced, social occasion-only smile. But this scene made the young noble lady in front of him shudder all over, her scalp going numb. She stumbled back in panic. I'll have my father prepare it for you at once. Then she turned and fled in embarrassment. The plot went completely off the rails again. Alan could only comfort himself. Maybe she's just rather shy. Top-grade horses from Palladian, Penia citrus tea, Valanda handmade metalworks, Malentino specialty wine. Box after box of gifts that could be called luxurious were soon delivered before him. Facing this exaggerated display, even Evan couldn't help exclaiming in amazement. Before coming, Alan had never expected the Palacio family's reputation could actually be this terrible. Coupled with the fact that he had personally dealt with 2 villainous brothers, in other people's eyes he was simply a monster with a dagger hidden behind his smile. The current Alan, Palacio, had already become a nightmare name that others were unwilling to mention. This made him, for a moment, develop a certain illusion, so he had to walk to the window to get some air. However, his every move was being watched by a striking red-haired girl. Gazing at the stars under the night sky, Alan couldn't help reflecting, where exactly did I start going wrong? At this moment, a clear voice interrupted his trance. Excuse me, may I speak with you alone for a while? Under Alan's gaze, the girl introduced herself. I'm Loria, the third daughter of Duke Altia's household. Hearing the surname Altia, Alan immediately calmed down. The Altia family, one of the three great dark forces in psychedelia, known as the Northern Scoundrels. But thinking carefully, given the current situation, any noble who dared to approach him on their own initiative couldn't possibly be ordinary in the first place. It was just that Alan remembered that, in the game's plot, there was no such person at all. Loria didn't beat around the bush, and said bluntly, I want to borrow your power. If I don't do this, I'll be killed soon. Please, help me. My father is critically ill. My elder sisters will definitely send people to get rid of me. After hearing her, Alan had a sudden realization. I see, so when the game starts, she's already dead. However, Alan still refused without hesitation, even if she was willing to offer half of the Altia family's wealth as payment. Because right now, he could barely protect his own life, let alone get involved in the internal struggle of a top-tier shadow power family. But looking at Loria's helpless figure, he still couldn't help saying softly, good things will happen. He didn't know, this offhand encouragement would completely rewrite the girl's life trajectory. Just then, that gorgeous red-haired woman raised a glass to him in greeting. Alan turned to look, and his heart sank, another big shot hidden behind the scenes. Now, anyone who took the initiative to come talk to him wasn't a pushover. The three major shadow powers of the Kingdom of Asteria, Altia in the north, Zenonia in the west, this red-haired woman before his eyes was precisely the eldest daughter of Count Zenonia's household, Kalia. Compared with Palacio's traditional noble-style mafia, this family was more like a fully corporate criminal syndicate. To protect the laid-back life he had long yearned for, Alan didn't want to get entangled with her at all. Kalia said she wanted to have a simple chat with him, but how could Alan possibly let her have her way? He could only refuse in the most tactful manner possible. Kalia, however, revealed a knowing smile. You really are just like the rumors say. I'm starting to look forward to our next meeting. After saying that, she left the ball. Yet the sentence she left behind only made Alan even more at a loss. The next day, Alan brought Evan to the front of a deep, secluded valley. That's right, this was the true purpose of his trip. He had come all this way to attend that boring ball, and the fundamental reason was, this place was close to the legendary Whispering Labyrinth. As long as you solved the puzzles of 8 rooms, you could obtain a precious divine artifact as a reward. As a hardcore veteran player of this game, he had long since memorized the relevant guide inside out. Even so, when he truly stood before this mysterious structure, he still couldn't hide his shock. After all, in the past he had only cleared this stage countless times in front of a screen. But now he was personally walking into it. The feeling was completely different. Powerful aerial magic beasts circling in the air were mercilessly crushed by the stone walls in an instant. In this labyrinth, if you answered even one question wrong, you would be executed on the spot. Seeing the young master's calm expression, Evan's heart was full of doubts. He really couldn't understand. This young master who had always stayed cooped up at home. How on earth could he remain so composed in such a dangerous place? In fact, a large part of why he willingly followed this mysterious master was, no matter how outrageous the young master's actions were, the final result would always lead to the correct answer. Facing a room full of gold, silver, and treasures, Alan only reached out and picked up a plain black ring. Leave the others. They can't be touched, he warned Evan. If they took anything else, it would invite endless disaster. This black ring named Restraint was his real objective on this trip. However, what happened next sent a chill down Evan's spine. All the golems in the labyrinth awakened and, without a sound, sealed off their retreat. These golems, were they also within your expectations? Just as he was thinking about how to escort the young master out, Alan said indifferently, leave it to me. Evan couldn't be reassured at all. With the young master's mere Tier 2 magic, it was impossible to withstand an army of golems on this scale. Under his horrified gaze, Alan activated Restraint. In the next second, everything around them seemed to have been put on pause. One who inherits a fragment of Nyakala's great will. Speak the 2 constraints you can bear. In the original game flow, this scene should have corresponded to a selection interface. But now, the hollow yet majestic voice echoed again. The reward for clearing the labyrinth has been changed to Restraint. Yes, just as the Black Ring's name implied, this was an absorption-type divine artifact that exchanged power by placing constraints upon oneself. Under the gaze of that presence, Alan stated the first constraint. Throughout all spellcasting, I must use Babylonian hand seals, in exchange for a trace of power that twists the world's laws. The enormous eye that veiled the starry sky silently accepted his request. Immediately after, he proposed the second constraint. Throughout all spellcasting, I must use Babylonian sacred words, in exchange for power equal to what I just gained. This condition made that towering outline fall silent for a moment. Alan's heart tightened, thinking he'd messed up. He had clearly just followed the skill icons in the game and rigorously recreated the hand seal and incantation pairing. In the original setting, only by using hand seals plus special phrases as a double restraint could you maximize spell damage. As a diehard player, he had long since mastered all Babylonia gestures and chants. After a moment, that magnificent voice rang out once more. Human who still remembers the great existence that was forgotten. You have inherited the will of God. We shall watch you always. Along with the echo, the black ring on Alan's hand slowly disappeared, meaning restraint had been established. Frozen time resumed its flow at this instant. Behind him, Evan was about to step forward to stop the young master from acting rashly. Yet this time, the lightning Alan gathered was completely different from before. In the past, even if he poured all the magic in his body into it, what he produced was no more than an ordinary lightning sphere. But now, this mass of thunderlight faintly carried a certain unspeakable alien power. What Alan wanted to test was the true might gained after using Babylonian hand seals and sacred words as constraints. With the low chant of an incantation, the surrounding power seemed to be crazily siphoned away, surging toward his palm. In just a few seconds, a huge energy sphere took shape and hovered there. He kept switching hand signs. Amid the interweaving of Babylonian hand seals and sacred phrases, the power of lightning instantly erupted. A massive thunderbolt poured out, blasting the huge golem in the distance directly into powder. On the ground, a ring of eerie, complex rune patterns remained. Evan stared blankly at those charred traces interwoven with symbols, his eyes full of shock. This is insane. Young master, have you been hiding your strength all along? In all he had seen and heard over 15 years as a mercenary, he had never seen anything like this. Is this really Tier 3 magic? Alan nodded, plunging him into even deeper silence. In fact, Alan himself was also somewhat at a loss. If his memory wasn't wrong, the game didn't have damage presentation this exaggerated. In Psychedelia's turn-based combat system, each turn, players could use runes or incantations to add amplifications to spells. What he had just released was a chain lightning, stacked with 5 amplifications. But even so, the theoretical damage was still nowhere near that kind of destructive effect just now. He couldn't help recalling what that great existence had just said, a human who has inherited God's will. But no matter how he thought about it, he still couldn't figure out what that sentence actually meant. The moment they walked out of the labyrinth, Evan plopped down on the ground, his legs going weak. He couldn't understand at all. Who could have built a place this horrifying? Alan suddenly remembered another name for the Whispering Labyrinth, Palane's Labyrinth. That was a title that would only be unlocked at a certain point in the game, and this labyrinth had an owner. He murmured, it was created by someone called Palaon. Before Evan could recover from the shock, Alan helped him up. Let's go back east. You've worked hard these past few days. In Psychedelia setting, choosing hand seals that matched a spell's attributes could increase its power, and pairing it with suitable incantations could also strengthen special effects. But this wasn't like the game, where it was just numbers going up. Just now, in reality, every incantation visibly changed the spell's form. Alan couldn't help calculating inwardly. Could it be because my magic control is fine enough that I can perceive these changes? Once my magic recovers a bit, I have to run systematic experiments. At this moment, atop a distant boulder, a black-robed figure silently watched the direction they departed. Emerald green pupils flashed with a faint glimmer in the shadows. In the next second, her figure flickered as she sped off into the distance. In no time at all, she arrived at the entrance of the Whispering Labyrinth that Alan had just cleared. On the stone wall, in ancient script of the Alanf Empire, was recorded an age of forgotten outer gods. Sin of greed. Renee lifted her hood, carefully scrutinizing those lines of mysterious inscriptions. They told the legendary life of the swordmaster Palaon, how he had once repelled the Black Shah that invaded the continent with his own strength, and then slain the evil fiend Akalaka that devoured his subjects' hearts. The only reason Rena could read and understand this was because she possessed the ancient library. But what she never expected was, the Great Moon not only knew of Palaon's existence, it could even chant spells that weren't recorded even in the ancient library. As expected, the one mentioned in history, the person Queen Blutia once followed, could never possibly be an ordinary existence. At this moment, she became even more convinced of everything Red Moon had said about that lord. A wave of shame rose in Rena's heart. Past her had only rigidly carried out orders, never trying to understand the Great Moon's true intent. Just then, subtle movements around her made her gaze turn cold again. Did you get the intelligence? Deus's voice came, but gave a negative answer. No, the man in black who was tailing that lord is already dead. Before I arrived, his head was twisted around twice in midair. Hearing this, Renee paused, deciding to return to the organization first and make a report. Meanwhile, at the Count of Zenonia's residence, what Kalia couldn't shake from her mind was Alan's indifferent gaze, as if it could freeze a person solid. And that line, "You're very famous." The Count of Zenonia's strength was common knowledge to all. But what was truly strange was, why would someone like her, who hardly ever showed her face in social settings, be judged by Alan as very famous? She looked toward her father, who was bent over his desk, and asked aloud, "Don't you think this is strange?" However, the Count of Zenonia was as if frozen, completely motionless. Kalia lightly snapped her fingers, and black mist quietly surfaced in the room. In the next moment, the Count of Zenonia began to move slowly, like a puppet being controlled. In fact, the one who truly held power over the Zenonia family was her. And by rights, no outsider should have known this. So how had that person noticed? What's more, he had easily discovered the covert watcher she had sent to monitor him. Just then, a family guard hurriedly barged in. "Lady Kalia, you'd better go take a look in your room." In her room, a cold corpse lay there quietly. Judging from the state of the body, he hadn't been tortured, nor had he leaked any intelligence. It was more like someone had deliberately placed him here for her to see. Kalia let out a cold laugh. "Looks like from the moment I met him, I'd already been swept into a huge whirlpool." And on the other side, Alan was still lying sprawled in a jolting carriage, too tired to want to move. After returning to the territory of Duke Altia, Loria's mood sank to rock bottom. Alan's performance was just as hard to deal with as she'd expected. As expected, the nobles to rule the underworld all have eyes as cold as fathers. Becoming enemies with a man like that was a choice she absolutely dared not consider. Loria knew very well that Alan was her last lifeline, but she also knew that given the other party's position and circumstances, he would never easily accept such a thankless, uphill deal. After all, she had already been stripped of all property and power by those despicable brothers and sisters, and now she had nothing. In the past, the only reason she could barely maintain a noble's lifestyle was because of her father's favoritism. And when her father was critically ill and she herself had been driven into a dead end, she couldn't even figure out what to do next. Just as she sank into chaotic thoughts, a shrill scream came from the corridor, and a maid rushed in, panicked and at a loss. "Lady Loria, Miss Pyron and young Master Keeg have committed suicide." This sudden news left her unable to react for a moment. How could people who wouldn't hesitate to raise a sword against their own siblings possibly choose suicide? She forced down the upheaval in her heart and asked about the situation of the other two elder brothers. Before she could finish speaking, a second scream came from upstairs. "My lady, young Master Tamalian and Miss Marianne are dead too." In just a short moment, all four siblings had died suddenly. This string of upheavals left her almost unable to speak, and she could only stand there dumbfounded. And at this moment, high above Duke Altia's manor, a black shadow swept past quickly. That person was none other than Sin of Envy Phaidon, who had just completed the mission. Watching the successive deaths, a name suddenly surfaced in Loria's mind. Alan, before leaving, that line about good things happening? So it was he, the behind-the-scenes mastermind of the ducal house, who had patiently lain low for years, waiting for the moment to strike. Only at this moment did she understand the true meaning of that sentence. She, like Alan, had become the ducal house's sole heir overnight. What followed was not joy, but total fear. What kind of devil did I sign a contract with? But she also knew, it was already too late to turn back. Countless bloody examples lay before her. What kind of end those who betrayed Alan would meet, she understood better than anyone. So from now on, she could only follow the choice she had made, all the way to the end. 2 months later, the Palacio family. A man, acting on Duke Altia's orders, delivered a gift to Alan. Evan opened the seal and introduced softly, "This is Cernan's wine." He had never imagined he'd have the chance today to see this famous vintage, rumored to be worth several thousand gold coins. But when Alan saw the attached gift card, he frowned. The signature on it wasn't Duke Altia, but Loria Altia. He immediately probed and verified with the servant who brought the wine. After receiving a positive answer, Alan finally became certain. Loria, who had originally been merely the second daughter, had now become the new Duke of Altia. At this time, inside the Duke of Altia's study, Loria slightly stretched her stiff shoulders. This room was a place she previously hadn't even been allowed to step into. And now, because of her siblings' successive deaths, she had naturally taken this chair. Because she had a perfect alibi on the night of the ball, no one could suspect her. What's more, the power she had secretly held had long since been uprooted by her brothers. When she returned to the estate, she was a duke's daughter in name, but in reality she had nothing. Only now did Loria belatedly realize Alan had even factored this into his plan. On the surface, he coldly refused her. In secret, he silently cleared away every obstacle for her. Maybe he foresaw all of this long ago. To avoid causing trouble for that lord, Loria deliberately didn't tell Alan the details of the duke's true death. In her heart she silently guessed, my lord must need Altia as a chess piece in some greater plan, which is why he extended a hand to me. Although she now controlled all the organizations under Altia, she knew very well, this bit of strength was fundamentally not comparable to the other forces under that lord's command. The Palacio family, an existence that could rise to become a giant of the underworld through commerce alone. She understood that lord was more inclined to manipulate the board from behind the scenes. What she could do was quickly straighten out the territory of Altia into a convenient chess piece. News from that side should be arriving soon, too. I hope he'll like the gift I sent. The corner of her lips lifted imperceptibly. Without even noticing it herself, a trace of gentle light surfaced in her eyes. After delivering the gift, Altia's butler bowed and withdrew. And over on the Palatial estate side, Alan was still immersed in shock. Loria, who not long ago had been shrouded by the shadow of death, had now actually become a duke in both name and fact. The direction of the plot is getting more and more absurd. In the blink of an eye, only 5 years remained until the original story officially began. The call from behind made Alan turn around. Although the succession ceremony had not yet been held, he could already legitimately use the title Count Palatio. Becoming a count was not part of his original plan. Still, living a good life under the cover of noble status, though it deviated a bit from the original goal, couldn't be called a bad thing. Evan stepped forward and handed him a letter. A letter from Miss Yusha. Alan asked offhand, "Have you found the mastermind behind Leo's assassination?" Evan shook his head. So far, the Intelligence Guild still has no results. In his understanding, the young master's pursuit of this matter probably wasn't for revenge. Alan nodded in acknowledgement, just in case. After all, I've already caused quite a few butterfly effects. The plot deviation is too severe. After speaking, he opened Yusha's letter. He wondered what kind of progress report it would be this time. The letter read, "How have you been lately? We've all been doing well, and everyone has found their own interests. Especially Deus. His puppet shows have reached perfection. Sealrang is obsessed with playing games with friends. Rina quietly reads and does handicrafts. Haydn has recently gotten hooked on arranging garden landscapes." Already used to receiving the orphanage's monthly daily life report, Alan's lips subconsciously lifted into a doting father sort of smile. He suddenly asked, "How old are they now?" Although Evan didn't understand why he was asking, he still replied, "They're probably all at the age where they can enter society. The children you rescued back then weren't that far apart in age." That sentence made the image in Alan's mind of a bunch of well-behaved, cute little angels instantly collapse. He vaguely conjured a terrifying picture. The 5 great sins that would destroy the world in the future, respectfully thanking him, their foster father. Just imagining it made his back go cold. Still, they were about at the age to go out and make their way in the world. He should make some plans for their future. Under his careful upbringing, they reasonably shouldn't go down the wrong path again. At the very least, they'd be able to support themselves. Alan rapidly reviewed each person's talents. Yusha, who possessed an aptitude for faith. Deus, who was proficient in swordsmanship. Rina, with an intense thirst for knowledge. Sealrang, who had the makings of a fighter. And Haydn, born with leadership. If he placed them in suitable positions, sooner or later they would become a force so terrifying it would be ridiculous. Thus, Alan decided to prepare a coming-of-age gift for each of the 5 great sins who were about to step into society. After all, these things would be useful sooner or later. Time passed. After a bout of high-intensity letter writing, Alan finally finished 5 letters. He handed the letters to Evan. "Sorry to make you run the trip. If everything goes smoothly, I might even squeeze a bit of return out of them. The kids who receive the letters should be heading toward a broader world, right? In the east, at the orphanage." Yusha announced to everyone. The Great Moon has made an exception this time and issued separate instructions to each person. The 5 young people each opened their own letter and, as if by prior agreement, revealed curious expressions. They had no idea what kind of mission that Lord would assign this time. Soon, a chorus of quiet discussion rose in the room. "This is just ordinary household chit-chat, isn't it? It doesn't look like an instruction letter at all." Unlike their confusion, Yusha wore an utterly certain expression. "My lord simply hid the orders inside everyday conversation." She pointed to several passages in old letters and explained patiently. "This is the first instruction after the greeting. My lord clearly pointed out the operational target and had me report follow-up developments. Here is the record of fully handing Blue Moon's authority over to me, and you were all personally chosen by that lord." She added that all these arrangements were to avoid information leaks. But the others still couldn't make sense of it. If that's the case, why not meet in person, or use magical communication? If you're worried about exposure, why insist on writing letters? Yushi's expression turned cold at once. "We only need to act according to the instructions." Sensing her near absolute trust, Deus still didn't understand. But he didn't press further. Sealrang broke the tension at the right moment. "Let's look at the other missions first." A moment later, everyone silently finished reading their own letters. Deus was dispatched to the Kingdom of Knights, Caliban. Sealrang was assigned to a desert colony, and she happened to hate deserts the most. Haydn's destination was the entertainment capital, Raxos. Rina, meanwhile, was arranged to go to the city of Labyrinth, Larthania. Yusha was to go to the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. The letters not only specified a target profession for each of them, but also included a promise of continuous resource support. And at each location, Alan marked for them the whereabouts of a gift. Once they went there in person, they would naturally understand. Before everyone set out, Yusha reminded them, unless that lord brings it up first. You absolutely must not speak the name Blue Moon. And so, the 5 great sins who should have destroyed the world, now each stepped onto their own stage. 3 months later, Alan was studying magical theory and spell structure. However, compared to mountains of paper knowledge, he believed more in practice. Suddenly, as if remembering something, he turned to Evan and asked, "Any new intelligence about the one who killed Leo?" Evan replied, "Same as last time, the guild has made no progress." This made Alan think of the term butterfly effect. He had already drastically changed the fates of the 5 great sins. Loria, who should have died, had now become Duke Altia, and her hidden forces were expanding through the dark world at an astonishing speed. He made his final decision. The investigation into Leo ends here. In the original script, there was almost nothing like this, an organization that left no trace even the Intelligence Guild could find. If he kept digging deeper, it might only invite mortal danger. And as long as he didn't take the initiative to contact those people, the other side most likely wouldn't come looking for trouble either. In that case, further pursuit was already meaningless. Just then, Evan added as if he had remembered something. Deus has recently been appointed a Knight of Caliban. Alan blinked. He became a knight that fast? Another 3 months passed. Evan brought new intelligence. Deus formed a knight order. Alan froze for quite a while before reacting. Didn't he only get knighted not long ago? Normally, to form a knight order, you'd at least have to reach swordmaster level, wouldn't you? But judging from the result, both of them were very satisfied with Deus's overly dazzling performance. Half a year later, the 5 great sins had been operating independently for a year. Alan completed the succession ceremony and gradually grew used to the Count's daily duties. That day, Evan brought shocking news again. Deus was ennobled as Caliban's 5th sword. Alan froze on the spot. The lightning sphere that had been gathering in his palm instantly dissipated. Isn't that a title only swordmasters are qualified to have? In Psychedelia's setting, a swordmaster was an existence beyond a magic swordsman. Those who reached that realm would awaken a talent skill. Just as Alan thought Deus had crossed that threshold, Evan explained, he can't yet be called a true swordmaster. Only half a step away, because the talent skill hasn't fully awakened. But the kingdom still insists on granting him the position of knight commander. That's because he defeated the 4th sword. And not long ago, on the battlefield against the northern barbarians, a master-tier knight died in battle. The kingdom's move both appeases public sentiment and displays military might to the outside. By theoretical development, it would take at least 10 more years for Deus to awaken his talent skill. After all, Caliban's current 1st sword, Reinhardt, was a name Alan knew extremely well. In the 3rd main story arc, he always appeared as a temporary ally to support the player. He had trained with the sword since age 5, the youngest sword saint in history. Even with such heaven-defying talent, it took him nearly 20 years to reach that realm. And now, someone who had once been a child who couldn't even hold a sword steady had, in a single year, approached that step. Thinking of this, Alan couldn't help clicking his tongue. The higher they fly, the richer my return. He swept his eyes casually over the tabletop and only then noticed the pile of letters set to the side. Over the past year, the list of correspondence had only ever had Yusha's name, which made him feel a little disappointed, like he might barely even get a bit of rebate. Even though Yusha was in the Holy Kingdom of Rosario, she still kept the habit of writing regularly, and in her letters she would also pass along greetings to Alan on behalf of the others. Clearly, the 5 great sins still maintained close contact. Alan felt slightly annoyed. Those guys didn't even say thank you after receiving the gifts. On second thought, he felt it wasn't worth fussing over. As long as they don't turn into the 5 great sins that destroy kingdoms, that's already something to thank the heavens for. As long as they're safe and living a bit more freely, everything else doesn't matter. Kirtham, the capital of the Kingdom of Caliban, the High Nobility District. A group of members of the Eclipse Knight Order were undergoing harsh training in the courtyard, and Deus stood by a high window of the nearest majestic castle, looking down at them. By now, he was already the commander of Caliban's Eclipse Knight Order, and also the youngest master-tier knight in the kingdom's history. He gazed absent-mindedly into the distance, when suddenly, a beautiful girl in the courtyard waved at him. Seeing this, the corners of Deus's mouth lifted involuntarily, and he raised a hand in response. That was the gift he had mentioned in his letter a year ago. At first, he hadn't taken this gift in the letter to heart, but when he followed the letter's instructions and rushed to that location, the scene before his eyes left him completely stunned. The younger sister who had once been taken away by the black monster was now standing there unharmed, broom in hand. He didn't have time to think, he only hugged her tightly. That boy who once had no expression broke down and cried his voice hoarse in that moment. The gift the Great Moon bestowed upon him was the return of a family member he had thought he'd lost forever. After a long time of sobbing and then calming down, Deus heard everything that had happened these past few years from his sister Silly. After being captured and separated from her family, she was locked in a dark cage for who knows how long. She had thought she would be cruelly killed like the others. But one day, a figure like light appeared before the cage and led her away from that desperate place. After that, she went through a period of wandering. until a slave trader tried to seize her, preparing to sell her as merchandise. In that moment of despair, a mercenary drew his sword. He called himself Evan and said he had been sent by young Master Alan. From then on, Silly continuously received all manner of precious medicinal materials and treatment care. That lord not only covered her food, clothing, shelter, and travel, but also secretly arranged for people to guard everything about her. Silly took a letter out from her bosom. This was written to me by that lord, telling me not to worry about my brother. Toward this benefactor she had never met, she was filled with gratitude. But Deus was full of doubts. How did the Great Moon know about these things? Since joining Blue Moon, he had never mentioned his family to anyone. Yusha had only inferred from the scars on his body that he had suffered harm from the Black Goat, and knew nothing about the details. In an instant, many scattered questions flashed through his mind, and in the next instant, they snapped together like a puzzle. At last he understood why Yusha was always anxious because of matters concerning my lord, and why she always kept saying my lord knows everything. So that lord truly does know everything. Long ago, from behind the scenes, he pointed out a path for every child. Thinking back on all his past reactions, Deus suddenly felt that he was the stupidest one of all. The boy who only wanted revenge against the Black Goat and wallowed in hatred was gone. The gift bestowed by the Great Moon was worth dedicating everything to. Only then did he understand. Yusha's following was not mad fanaticism, but a trust that had been proven. One day, you'll understand too, why I follow that lord. To answer the task entrusted by the Great Moon, Deus would use all his strength to repay this kindness. He would follow that lord's will, become Caliban's strongest swordmaster, and form the finest knight order, dedicating all glory to the Great Moon. It's time. A voice pulled his thoughts back to reality. Deus looked at the knight who held him in deep respect, gave a slight nod, then turned and walked toward the training grounds. There, the members of the Eclipse Knight Order were already lined up in neat ranks. They were about to set out on an expedition to fight the northern barbarians, and on that battlefield they would hone an edge sharper than they had now. Deus stepped onto the review platform, raising his sword with one hand while the other rested on the hilt, his gaze sweeping across the knights' faces one by one. Then, he held the blade upright before him and chanted in a low, firm voice, "Under moonlight, prove yourselves." As the slogan fell, he turned and, leading the Eclipse Knight Order, set out on the road of expedition. At this time, there were only 4 years left until the original plot officially began. Ever since attending the ball a year ago, Alan had taken that day as a starting point, and thrown himself headlong into the mysteries of phrases, continuing to explore them, pouring in time and energy day after day. In the game, reciting phrases consumed turns, and with each turn that passed, magic attack power increased once. Facts proved that, just as he had expected, these phrases really could change the nature of magic. Alan recorded, one by one in meticulous detail, the phrases he had used when he obtained restraint back then. Inflection, deflective, linear. Inflection was to reinforce the incompleteness of already completed magic, thereby achieving area diffusion. Reverse pull was to destroy the established form of magic, achieving the transfer of already launched projectiles. Azure light was like shock magic, strengthening magic cast in parallel. And diffractive linear was to grant magic a piercing effect. Put more plainly, critical hit. Although Alan now had enough time to research magic, the real-world limitation was, each day, the number of times he could actually cast magic with his own hands was only once. This also made his research progress appear especially slow. If only there were a book that specifically talked about phrases. All the vocabulary he had used previously was, by setting, long forgotten in history, Babylonian phrases, regarded by this world as taboo knowledge. And Alan only knew the phrases and how to use them, knowing nothing about the rules behind them. And it was precisely because of that he began researching them. Unexpectedly, together with his own talent, he very naturally immersed himself in experiments with phrases and magic. Then, as usual, he began today's only casting, testing the Tier 2 magic he had researched for the past 2 months, Chain Lightning. He skillfully formed the hand seal he used most often. Magic gathered around him, turning into streaks of electric light. According to Alan's design, after the parallel arranged magic trajectories formed a circular sphere, he deliberately erased several specific nodes inside it to create imbalance, and then stacked a fixed term on top of it. The lightning sphere that had just been manifested before him, at the instant he spoke the incantation, seemed as if time had been pressed to pause, frozen amid overflowing arcs and crackling sounds. After that, he softly chanted the second phrase, compression. The lightning that had originally been like a giant ball suddenly contracted, in its stopped state, down to the size of a marble. Next came the third phrase, collapse. The magic body that had just maintained a perfect spherical shape immediately lost its sphere outline, leaving only a pure and primal lightning form. When Alan spoke the final incantation and released the hand seal he had been holding, enormous thunder was drawn down out of the cloud layer, condensing before him into a tree of thunder. That blue tree stood unmoving in midair. Its radiance even outshone the blazing midday sun, and in its congealed posture, it displayed its overwhelming power to the world. Only then did Alan truly realize, so the order of incantations also changes the way magic is manifested. Just then, a voice interrupted his train of thought. He turned around, and his gaze landed on the person he least wanted to face head-on. Kalia, the daughter of the Count of Zenonia. Kalia was staring slack-jawed at the scene before her. She, who always maintained noble elegance, now had her mouth open in a perfect oval, clearly shaken to the core. Before Alan could figure out why she had appeared here, the man standing beside Kalia had already cried out in shock. Impossible. This is absolutely impossible. That is an innate origin magic that only a 7th-tier mage can use. Only then did Alan belatedly realize. He seemed to have been swept into an extremely absurd misunderstanding. A little later, in the reception room of the Count of Palacio's residence, Kalia still couldn't calm down, and her mind couldn't shake off the afterimage of that tree of thunder. In fact, she had come here today for only 2 purposes. First, to confirm Alan's, namely, the current Count of Palacio's, true intentions. In the intelligence she possessed, Alan held a trump card in his hands that was enough to severely damage the Count of Zenonia's house. Although she knew that Alan and she were, in terms of stance, fellow travelers, the relationship between the Zenonia and Palacio houses had always been terrible, so she had to confirm his attitude. Second, to confirm the true level of that organizational force rumored to be controlled by the Count of Palacio. From what she had currently sounded out, it was only the tip of the iceberg. Yet what Kalia cared about even more at this moment was Viankel, sitting to the side, still with trembling lips and a pale face. This man had once been highly praised in the Mage Tower academic world for proposing a new theory regarding Forgotten-era magic. In the end, however, he was expelled by the Mage Tower for excessively cruel and inhumane magical experiments. He was a Tier 5 powerhouse capable of single-handedly crushing an infantry brigade. Kalia had formed an alliance with him in exchange for assisting his experiments. In her impression, Vianko was absolutely not the kind of person who would show such an undignified expression in public. Yet now, seeing the way he looked as if he were desperately suppressing fear, she felt for the first time, this man was truly afraid of something. This dread felt unfamiliar and eerie even to her. Not long after, Alan walked into the reception room from outside. With a gaze so cold it was almost inorganic, he slowly swept over Vianko and Kalia. "You too, what is it?" Kalia stood first and saluted. "Your Excellency, Count Palacio, please forgive my sudden visit today and my presumptuous behavior." As the outward Miss Zenonia, she now nevertheless had to lower her head as a junior to Alan, who had already become a count, and apologize for barging into the training grounds. Alan fell silent for a moment before speaking. "As for today, I'll treat it as if it never happened. But one point must be clarified. I was not using origin magic just now. As for my magical strength, it isn't outstanding either. If we insist on classifying it by tier, it can probably only be considered Tier 2. This explanation made the two of them instantly understand his real meaning. He wanted them to keep absolutely silent about everything they had seen today. I must have seen it wrong. Vianko used honorific language for once, rather than the plain speech he habitually used. This was the first time in 5 years that Kalia had heard him speak with this attitude, and she couldn't help being stunned again. Alan, believing the misunderstanding had been resolved, asked in relief, "Since the misunderstanding has been cleared up, do you have any other business coming to the Count's residence?" Kalia explained, a bit nervously, that she had merely happened to be passing nearby and had thus decided on a whim to pay a visit. Alan pondered for a moment, then said slowly, "I regret that I have been busy with affairs lately, and I'm afraid I cannot exchange many pleasantries with the two of you." These words were, without doubt, a dismissal order. The two, already fearful, immediately took the cue and rose to take their leave. Just as Kalia was about to leave the reception room, Alan suddenly added, "If you have something you need to confide, you might as well pay Duke Altia a visit. I think you should get along quite well." Faced with Alan's emotionally flat statement, Kalia only felt her throat go dry, and could only force out a polite smile, then salute and leave. Watching the carriage recede slowly into the distance, Evan couldn't help wondering, isn't the Count of Zenonia's house just that utterly rotten family in the West? Why would she come here? To that question, Alan didn't know how to answer. At this moment, what he truly feared was rumors spreading everywhere that he can use origin magic, thereby drawing in a bunch of absurdly powerful monsters to come knocking and pick a fight. As for telling Kalia to go see Duke Altia, in essence it was merely an opportunity to release a signal. He had no intention of establishing any relationship with her. Alan only hoped that woman would never appear again from this day forward. Inside the returning carriage, the magic Count Palacio used just now. It really wasn't origin? Kalia stared at the mage opposite her and asked in a low voice. Viankel didn't answer immediately as he usually did, but after a long silence, he slowly shook his head. That wasn't origin. He steadied his breathing and continued. Origin is the terminal station for all mages. It is also a sheet of drawing paper. It grants itself only to those who establish magic as law. On that sheet, they can draw their own system of rules. But Count Palacio's magic is different. More precisely, What he displayed was like tearing the drawing paper itself, approaching the source of law. Vyanko added, trembling. Forcibly fixing never-ending lightning in place, twisting its laws, making magic that has already been cast collapse, and then reconstructing it again without the slightest damage. This is a miracle that defies common sense, and the existence hidden behind this miracle. In his mind appeared those pitch-black pupils from just now. That gaze was like some forgotten great deity, observing the world through a damaged sculpture. Vyanko instinctively clutched his head, forcibly cut off his own thoughts, and even used magic to suppress his associations. He knew very well that continuing to deduce the true face of that thing was extremely dangerous. He only warned Kalia sternly, "You absolutely cannot treat him as an enemy, and even more so you cannot confront him head-on." Only at this point did she finally realize, from the very beginning, those plans about testing the Count of Palacio's intentions had in fact been self-deception. Perhaps she really should go pay Duke Altia a visit, because Kalia suddenly understood that she had long since become a piece in someone's chess game. About 5 months later, Alan looked at Evan standing at the doorway and asked, "Any new news? Is it about those kids?" However, what Evan said next made Alan's heart jolt. The Zenonia Count's house has formed an alliance with the Altia Ducal house. Alan couldn't help but think, could it be because of that line I casually said back then? He comforted himself that this might just be a temporary cooperative relationship, trying to use that explanation to cover the trace of unease in his heart. But even that faint sense of wrongness was enough to make him decide to take some precautions. So he wrote another letter, explanatory in nature. After taking the letter, Evan said he would have the Intelligence Guild forward it to Miss Kalia, and would continue tracking news about the kids. Alan, meanwhile, looked at the letter from Yusha that arrived as usual today, and in his heart couldn't help feeling a bit more worried about Sealrang. He was afraid she might die in a foreign land. If Sealrang could find the gift he had prepared for her, she could absolutely become an outstanding Baba Yaga. Because that item was even clearly recorded in the game guides, so long as the sin of pride obtained it, she would not fall into becoming true evil, but would instead become a great werewolf. But for a full 9 months there had been no news of her at all. No matter how Alan told himself, she must be fine, that bit of unease still refused to go away. At this time, at the eastern edge of the continent, in the southern part of the desert colony, in the deepest depths of a cave, a young girl hummed a tune as she briskly walked out of the darkness. Sealrang wore a smile she couldn't suppress, and said loudly, "It's finally over. Great Moon, thank you for the gift you bestowed." She was completely immersed in the joy of obtaining the gift. Only now did she truly understand that the stories of the Golden King she had heard as a child had all been true. To her Golden Mane tribe, it was a legendary object passed down from the distant past. It was precisely because of this object that, hundreds of years ago, the Golden Mane tribe had been able to ascend to the throne of the Orc King. It would grant the Golden Mane tribe the authority of power. After passing the layers upon layers of trials laid down by the divine artifact, Sealrang finally realized that those seemingly absurd oral tales from her childhood had not contained a single lie. From the bottom of her heart, she offered her gratitude to the Great Moon. That lord not only pulled her back from the edge of death, but also granted her power enough to take revenge on the black dragon that had killed her parents. She had to repay this kindness. Even if she didn't consider herself smart, she understood that the Great Moon's intent could never be merely to have her become an ordinary gladiator. That glove that granted the Golden Mane tribe the authority of power let her grasp the moon's true purpose. Become the strongest gladiator, recreate the long-vanished glory of the Golden Mane tribe, and ultimately kill that hateful black dragon with her own hands. With an ever more brilliant smile, she stepped out of the pitch-black cave. Outside the cave, a bright moon hung high over the desert sky. She lifted her head and spoke the declaration that had now become her catchphrase, "Everything is for the Great Moon." The day after Kalia visited Alan. Because the young master had previously been worried about Sealring, Evan specially went to investigate, and he managed to learn some intelligence from the guild. It was said that in the desert colony, a gladiator who was unusually active had recently appeared, and people called her Golden Flash. The moment that title reached his ears, Alan for no clear reason felt it sounded familiar. More importantly, the heart he had held suspended for so long finally settled a little. Evan then advised him not to worry too much. That place was one where the bigger your name, the better your Dayu. As long as your strength was sufficient, you could even stand on equal footing with the king. Alan couldn't help asking again, "What about Haydn? Any news of him lately? After he went to Rax's, he never wrote to me again." Evan did hear some rumors, but he couldn't confirm whether they were true. Alan suddenly spoke as if remembering something. "Have you been free lately? I'm planning to take a trip to the Mage Tower." But when he described the expected itinerary, Evan couldn't help looking baffled. In his impression, from the Count's residence to the Green Mage Tower was at most about a week's journey. Why would it take a month? When Alan added that he wasn't going to the Green Mage Tower, but the Blue Mage Tower, Evan could only let out a long sigh. Knowing the young master's temperament well, he left one sentence before exiting the room. "Then I'll make preparations in advance." Just thinking about having to spend a full 3 weeks in a jolting carriage made Alan feel as if all his bones had been pulled out. He slumped on the sofa and didn't want to move. But this was something he had to do. Only there were the conditions that would let a half-baked person like him carry out multiple full magic experiments within a single day. Suddenly, he remembered something. Next to the Blue Mage Tower was the Labyrinth City, Larthania. In the center of this beautifully named city, there was a labyrinth that led underground and extended infinitely. In the game, it was almost the only place where you could grind experience and items infinitely without advancing the main story. The labyrinth structure was extremely simple and straightforward. The deeper the floor, the higher the level, and the richer the experience and treasures you could obtain. This made him think of Rinna, and he wondered how she was doing now. When he had sent Rinna to Larthania back then, he hadn't intended for her to become a labyrinth explorer, but rather wanted to cultivate her into a magical item appraiser. Alan suddenly realized that the gift he had given Rinna, could it have been a bit shabby? In fact, compared with the gift given to the other 5 great sins, the thing in Rinna's hands could at most be considered a tool specifically used for equipment appraisal. The Labyrinth City Larthania was completely different from other countries. It was an independent city filled with mercenaries and adventurers, yet ruled by no nation. Passing one shop after another, in a remote corner of the southern district, there was a small, inconspicuous store hidden away. The owner of this shop was a magical item appraiser who deliberately hid her true identity. With her one-of-a-kind service, her name quietly spread through upper circles. Most of her customers were nobles and A-rank adventurers, including even Larthania's lord. The woman wearing a crescent moon pattern mask spoke slowly. "My lord, everything has been appraised. This time it's a device that can continuously produce flames by injecting magic into it. And it's also a relic that can bear an inscription. Its effect is that as long as you inject a small bit of magic, it can maintain a flame for 1 hour." The lord, having heard this, was very satisfied. After thanking her repeatedly, he left the shop. Only after confirming there was no one else in the shop did she remove her mask. The face beneath the mask was one of the 5 great sins, sin of greed, Rinna. This shop called Murd, even though it was opened in the remote southern district, could earn more wealth than any appraiser. The reason was simple. She could not only appraise high-tier relics, but also inscribe some specific antiquities, further strengthening their original abilities. But this was not her own ability. Rina's true talent was only that, relying on the library, she could grasp an artifact's true nature more precisely, carry out practical appraisals of it, or identify those specific antiquities that could be inscribed. As for the ability of inscription itself, it came entirely from the gift bestowed by the Great Moon, a golden eyeball wrapped in a blue halo. At first, like the other sins, Renee also didn't understand why the Great Moon had sent her to the Labyrinth City and arranged for her to do work like being an appraiser. However, she knew that Lord's true identity was a figure of the Outer God era long forgotten by time. Thus she guessed that perhaps this had something to do with dealing with black things. Yet she still couldn't understand, because she, who possessed the library, knew very well how terrifying black things were. She couldn't see any connection at all between killing black things and being an appraiser. Not until she truly understood the meaning of that gift. What the Great Moon had given her was the Sage's Eye, a divine artifact that could quickly identify and filter out items below a certain mana threshold. With the library, she could tell at a glance that this Sage's Eye was anything but ordinary. She undid the layers upon layers of seals on this eyeball, one for which no records could be found even in the library. The Sage's Eye, which had originally been just an ordinary sphere, finally revealed its true form and unlocked a special ability. Ascription. So-called inscription was the method of carving a mark onto high-tier relics, thereby increasing the relic's ability values. But strangely, the inscription the Sage's Eye initially displayed didn't look like a simple function. More precisely, it was closer to a form of sacrifice. Once an inscription was completed, the relic's ability values would rise, but at the same time, during the inscription process, this golden eyeball would absorb a kind of power that even Rena herself couldn't fully understand, accumulating and nurturing this unknown power until it blooms and bears fruit. She vaguely realized that was probably what she truly needed to do. She also knew very well that only she herself could make this eyeball truly mature, because the Sage's Eye would only react to the tiny subset of high-tier relics that carried a specific pattern. If she used relics that didn't meet the conditions, it would instead cause the power the eyeball had accumulated to gradually dissipate. In addition, she could almost be certain this eyeball would, one day, grant her the power to fight black things. Rena gently stroked the golden eyeball floating in midair. As if treating some priceless treasure, everything will move forward in accordance with the Great Moon. About 3 weeks later, Alan finally arrived at the Blue Mage Tower by carriage. According to the original plan, he should have gone to pay his respects to the tower's master. Unfortunately, the master was away. The person he met was the Deputy Tower Master, Finief Krazine, a mage who had reached Tier 7 at the age of 22 and was known as a genius. However, the moment they met, this Deputy Tower Master put on an air of being swamped with work. After having him briefly explain his purpose, she planned to send him away directly. Faced with being shown the door the instant they met, Alan couldn't help but freeze for a moment. After all, there were only 6 mage towers in this world. They had practically monopolized the entire United Kingdom's essential manufactured supplies, including those needed by high nobles. In other words, mages' combat power, plus their monopoly over material production, put the mage tower's authority almost on the same level as noble power. Alan understood this structure, but wasn't this treatment a bit too much? At the very least, he was a count. Seeing Fenia busy non-stop with no intention of giving him any face at all, Alan had no choice but to play his real trump card. He said calmly, "I can eliminate time scars." Those words made Fenia's hand stop. So-called time scars were spatial rifts caused by the collision of powerful magic. They connected to unknown subspaces, allowing horrifying monsters of unclear origin to pierce through and descend upon this world. Fenia immediately activated a magic power check, but upon seeing Alan's manner density, she couldn't help sneering. "With your level?" She had originally planned to kick him out, but she hadn't expected Alan to persist, insisting that he could eliminate time scars. Fenia's expression instantly turned cold. "Do you have any idea how many people have said that in front of me? You think you're the only one who comes here to eliminate time scars and pick up some treasure on the side?" Yet Alan remained calm. "Just take me to where the time scar is." Although Fenia usually wasn't very interested in worldly affairs, she had heard a little about the rumors surrounding House Palatial. "You think that just because you cleaned up your brothers with some despicable means, you can do whatever you want?" After becoming a count, Alan had stopped meddling in anything in the underworld and simply lived his life quietly. But precisely because of that, the rumors about him only grew more outrageous. Facing Fenia's aggressive pressure, Alan was actually so nervous that his palms were sweating. But with Evan's repeated persuasion beforehand, he could only grit his teeth and push on. "I can wager all my property. If I can't eliminate the time scar, I'll donate all of the Count's estate's assets to the Blue Mage Tower. If necessary, I can also swear an oath." Fenia frowned and fell silent for a moment, then finally agreed. She led Alan to a door underground. "If you fail, then all of the Count's estate's property will be mine." In fact, she was also curious. Was this young Count the mastermind behind killing off all the heirs, or just someone who lucked into the position? Personally, she leaned toward the latter. Of course, she could also sense that subtle, strange aura about Alan, but in the end it was only presence. From the mana she had sensed before, his level was at most tier 2. The two quickly arrived at the location of the time scar. It was also a thorny problem for the Blue Mage Tower. Up to now, no one had been able to close it, so Fenia had even less reason to believe the tier 2 mage in front of her. She had originally intended to let him leave at that point, but she didn't expect Alan to suddenly form a hand seal. This action made Fenia pause slightly, because Alan's movements right now resembled a certain ritual structure she had seen in books on ancient magic. She assumed the other party was just imitating the motions, and was about to tell him to stop putting on such empty theatrics. Just then, Alan began to chant in a low voice. Fenia's expression froze instantly. She even forgot to breathe, because within her field of view, a gigantic eye interwoven in red and black was floating high above Alan's head. In the next moment, that eerie eye slowly opened. The oppressive pressure felt like some ancient god was looking down at her. Instinct drove her to immediately cut off her own thoughts and magic. She understood very clearly. Something like that absolutely must not be understood. It was like a holy grail filled with deadly poison. The moment you tried to comprehend it, destruction would only be a matter of time. After she finally forced herself to break off her thinking, Fenia realized that Alan's index finger had somehow ended up pointing at her. Absolute prohibition. Understanding that this was an order, Fenia shut her eyes in terror. Immediately after, the horrifying eyeball slowly closed, as if it had never existed. With the eye's disappearance, the magic quietly ended as well. Alan let out a soft breath. For a multi-run player, closing a time scar wasn't difficult. After all, time scars were never closed with magic to begin with, but by using specific items and an operational procedure. It was just that, considering there were still a few items in the future that could only be obtained by passing through the gate of time and space, Alan used his most convincing-looking magical performance so far this time in order to fool Fenia. But when he turned his head, he found Fenia's expression abnormal. She looked as if she had seen something she never should have seen, and kept muttering things like "I will absolutely never tell anyone." Alan was confused instead. Had she seen through the method he used to close the time scar? Just as he was considering whether he should simply come clean, Fenia suddenly panted urgently, her tone full of fear. "Please don't judge me by how I usually am. I'm actually the best at keeping secrets. I absolutely won't tell anyone." Alan looked at the Deputy Tower Master suddenly using honorifics, his face full of question marks. Why are you even using honorifics now? Having achieved the purpose of this trip, Alan went to find Evan and prepare to leave. There was no need for him to stay any longer. Besides, that Fenia who seemed to dislike him might decide to pick a fight with him again someday for no reason. Just then, Fenia hurriedly chased after him. "These are magic potions I prepared. Please accept them." Alan looked at her face, which ought to have been sharp but was forcing out a stiff smile, then lowered his head to examine the potions closely. The deep blue liquid, with the slightest swish, would give off a white sheen, clearly extremely expensive high-tier goods. 2 bottles of this could be exchanged for a small villa. Yet Phinia, smiling stiffly, asked carefully whether he liked them. She then stammered on to add that she would absolutely keep everything she saw just now secret. If you don't believe me, I can make a mana oath. Only then did Alan realize he had probably been seriously misunderstood again, and he was about to speak up to explain. However, before he could get the words out, Phinia had already activated magic first. Vast mana instantly flooded the entire office, so intense it made Alan's heart tighten. Countless chains surged out of the magic circle, extending toward the 2 of them. Before Alan could say anything, those chains had already tightly bound the terrified Phinia and the stiff-faced Alan. An unbreakable mana oath was thereby established. Looking at Phinia, who had no intention of clearing up the misunderstanding and instead used an oath to bind herself to him tightly, Alan could only give a flat nod in the end, swallowing his words back down. After obtaining those 5 bottles of mana recovery potion, as well as the relic he truly wanted, Alan boarded the carriage returning from the Blue Mage Tower to the Count's estate. He subconsciously lowered his head and looked at the bracelet on his wrist. It was the relic Phinia had permitted him to take after he closed the time scar, and it was the true purpose of this trip to the Blue Mage Tower, the Tainted One's bracelet. The bracelet's design could hardly be called delicate. It looked like the kind of cheap item you could buy on the market for under 10,000. But for Alan right now, it was the most important thing. Because the ability of the Tainted One's bracelet was to automatically absorb and store the mana in the air, and let the holder use it freely when needed. Of course, there was an upper limit to how much mana the bracelet could store, and it wasn't much. Ridiculously, even this not at all exaggerated capacity was still more than Alan's own mana cavity could hold. This left Alan speechless for a moment. He hadn't expected his body to be worse than a magical item. Still, after a while, his mood eased. After all, at the most fundamental level, he had come looking for this Tainted One's bracelet in order to research magic more efficiently and add an extra layer of self-protection in a crisis, not for head-on combat. Once he thought that through, he simply stopped dwelling on the question of mana capacity. It was just that he still didn't understand what, exactly, Phinia had misunderstood. She had been so arrogant at first, yet now she was bowing respectfully in front of the carriage, polite to an excessive degree. Compared with the her he saw when he first arrived at the Blue Mage Tower, she was practically a different person. Alan couldn't make sense of it no matter how he thought about it. That expression was exactly like the one Kalia had worn the last time she came, and that mage beside her. His expression was almost identical as well. But toward things he couldn't understand, Alan had always followed the principle of if you can't figure it out, don't think about it. In any case, he probably wouldn't have much contact with her in the future. He might as well let her keep misunderstanding. Under the warm sunlight, the carriage slowly headed back the way it had come. Meanwhile, in Duke Altia's territory, 2 strikingly beautiful women sat facing each other, chatting easily and exchanging courtesies. One of them was the new master of this territory, the current Duke of Altia, Luria. She had completely taken over the Altia family's power and inherited all the real authority left by the previous Duke. And the young woman sitting opposite her was the Miss Sinonia on the surface. More precisely, she was the one who actually controlled all authority in House Sinonia, Kalia. After listening to Alan's suggestion last time, Kalia had already understood Alan's true intent. Afterward, she proactively came to see the current Duke of Altia, Luria. After a conversation, the 2 of them were surprised to discover they now both belonged under the Count of Palatio. Since they had already confirmed an absolutely unopposable first seat, there was no longer any meaning in continuing to fight over so-called tiers of authority and territory. When Luria asked Kalia what, exactly, her visit today was about, Kalia carefully took a letter out from her bosom and placed it on the table. Luria picked up the letter and slowly read it. The content was mostly brief greetings and trivial matters about noble families. It looked extremely ordinary, yet Kalia instinctively believed things could not possibly be that simple on the surface. Luria strongly agreed with that speculation as well. From what she knew of the Count of Palatio, that lord would never be willing to waste time and effort on such insignificant matters. Sharing the same view, the 2 tried to read hidden meaning from these seemingly bland words. No one knew how long passed before they finally sensed a certain leaning in a passage from the 3rd sentence of the letter. That was, the Count was quite dissatisfied with both the current noble faction and the royalist faction. Could it be that he plans to wipe them all out? This was the thought that surfaced in both their minds almost simultaneously. Overthrow the kingdom's existing system, and then build a brand new regime on that foundation. For a moment, both of them fell into fear and shock. Only then did Luria truly realize why Alan needed her reputation, and why he had deliberately placed her in the position of Duke of Altia. If that was his true objective, then every arrangement suddenly made sense. Thus, the 2 realized they had to prepare a plan in advance, so that at the instant the Count issued a call, they could respond immediately. On the other side, at the Blue Mage Tower, after the Tower Master returned from his trip, he was surprised to discover that in the time he had been away, so many things had happened. Those intelligence fragments that had originally been unrelated now seemed to have been forcibly pieced together into a single whole. Meanwhile, Alan was sitting in a forest where the sky had darkened early and the temperature was gradually dropping, coughing hard from being choked by roasted sweet potato smoke, yet still finding the sweetness in his mouth exceptionally wonderful. Tortured by the carriage's constant jolting all the way until now, he couldn't wait to get home. At this time, in the Holy Kingdom of Rosario, beneath a statue of the goddess Charonia, symbolizing the moon and peace, a white-haired nun stood quietly. Her nun's habit was neatly pressed and pure white, and a faint smile hung at the corners of her lips. This nun was none other than one of the 5 great sins, sin of wrath, Yusha. After the master of the Blue Mage Tower, Selim Micardo, returned multiple times, he soon noticed something. During the time he had been away, some enormous abnormality had already disappeared, because at this moment, he could no longer sense the existence of the time scar at all. When he confirmed further, he saw Fenia, usually so arrogant and supercilious, like a deflated ball, lifelessly stating that she had already completed every task he had assigned. This left Selim completely baffled. Ever since Fenia, relying on astonishing talent, had been promoted to Deputy Tower Master at such an age, her arrogance and frivolity had long since pierced the heavens. Even so, Selim had never intended to deliberately grind down her sharp edges, precisely because Fenia maintained an extremely pure devotion to the single thing called magic. Once she truly stepped into the 7th ring, she would naturally realize how small she was, understand how negligible her current achievements were, and thus naturally learn humility. That was precisely why the current scene struck him as extremely abnormal. He couldn't help asking whether his trip had been so long that she had grown weary of the affairs at hand. Under his repeated questioning, Fenia finally drooped her head and said in a low, dispirited voice, "It was that count." He closed the time scar. Only then did Selim, from her halting account, barely piece together the rough course of events. Constrained by the mana oath, Fenia could not speak all the details. But to a Mage Tower Master, even a few scattered words were enough to reconstruct an outline close to the truth. He gently patted his beloved disciple's hair. "I didn't expect that Count would actually be able to make you this humble. Origin magic, or something else?" Fenia, so frightened she didn't even have the courage to smack his hand away, made Selim even more curious about that Count of Palacio. Time flowed on. 1 month had already passed since returning from the Blue Mage Tower. After obtaining the Tainted One's bracelet, Alan finally began a research path in the true sense. Now, the number of times he could use magic each day had risen to 3. If he allocated things properly, he could even squeeze out a 4th. During this period, he also grasped a new incantation rule. Even completely identical incantations could not be stacked, but if the incantation structures were similar, it was still possible to replicate a certain overlapping effect. While he was conducting experiments as usual, Evan came up from behind. "My Lord Count's magic is getting more and more outrageous. For Tier 2 magic to hit with this kind of power just isn't reasonable. Though the magic you've used didn't look like ordinary Tier 2 to begin with, it still feels a bit different compared to a few months ago." The two of them looked together toward the center of the training grounds. A huge crater had appeared there. That was the result of one of the Tier 1 spells Alan was researching, gravity. By rights, this was only a gravity-type Tier 2 magic, yet it had forcibly produced an effect far beyond expectations. Alan suddenly had an illusion. His magic seemed to be getting stronger and stronger without him noticing. This was definitely not merely an improvement from proficiency. After all, what proficiency could bring was nothing more than improved precision and finer manifestation. Nor was it that the incantations themselves had become stronger. Starting 4 months ago, he had repeatedly cast using similar incantations. In the past 2 weeks, he had even alternated almost perfectly among all incantations with similar frameworks, and the final conclusion was, when he adjusted the incantation sequence to an optimal state, the spell's power would increase steadily, not spike upward all of a sudden. Yet the present situation made him scratch his head. By rights, magic couldn't suddenly become stronger for no reason at all. Could it be that I've been in good form lately? With that unreliable guess, he took the letter Yusha had sent from Evan. Since today's 3 available casts had already been used up, Alan had to temporarily end the experiments, turn toward the office, and prepare to rest while reading Yusha's letter. As he walked, he flipped through the letter and sorted through various possible causes in his mind. In this world, sudden increases in strength came down to no more than 2 cases, either obtaining faith or compensation from a curse. It had to be one of the 2, excluding the former first, that left only being cursed. And the form a curse's compensation took was likewise no more than 2, either he inherited a curse directed at him when someone else sacrificed themselves, or he had placed a curse on himself. But curses were a product of the Eastern system. Up to this point, he had not had contact with anyone from the East at all. As for obtaining faith, That makes even less sense. Unable to come up with a reasonable explanation, Alan could only pretend he hadn't seen it. As usual, he simply chose to avoid the question. The Holy Kingdom of Rosario was completely different from the theocratic state of Baltican outside the empire. Here, the people worshipped the chief deity Chironia, the goddess who symbolized the moon and peace. At this moment, in the eastern part of Rheinal, known as the City of Pure White, inside a prayer hall, a knight was walking slowly toward the girl standing before the statue. Faced with a nun who seemed not to be of high rank at all, and who didn't even have the mark of holy grace on her shoulder, this armored knight still greeted her with a respectful salute. Hearing the voice, Yusha, dressed in a spotless white nun's habit, turned around and quietly accepted his greeting. "Sir Lok, how have you been lately?" To a nun whose position within the church hierarchy was not at all conspicuous, Lok still maintained heartfelt respect. "Thanks to you, sister, this time I saved 8 children and 25 lives in villages on the eastern and western sides. All of it was bestowed by you." Yusha only smiled gently. "Sir Knight, you are too modest. The one who saved them was you, Sir Lok." Yet Lok still shook his head firmly, as if her words could not sway his faith in the slightest. "Indeed, wielding my sword to save people is what I did. But the one who granted power to someone like me, who had nothing, was you, sister." In fact, just as he said, Lok had not originally been a holy knight. He was a young man who believed in the goddess Chironia. Out of longing for holy knights, he underwent the relevant training, yet for a long time he could not wield that sacred power every holy knight had to master. After failure upon failure, he gradually fell into despairing dejection. Just when he was almost ready to give up, he met her. The first thing this woman, whose pupils were crimson and whose lips always carried a faint smile, said to the despairing Lok was, "If you truly crave that kind of power so much, then why not try believing in the great moon?" At first, Lok did not understand this line at all. In his view, what essential difference could there be between believing in Chironia, the moon goddess, and believing in the moon? The nun only told him, "Only by truly doing it will you understand the difference." Back then, Lok had no way out. If it could give him the power he had dreamed of, he was willing to try anything. So he began praying to the moon, day after day. And just as the nun had said, without even realizing it, he truly learned how to wield that sacred power. But in that instant, a new fear was born in him. He feared he had stepped onto a heretical path, because now, what he believed in was no longer the goddess Chironia, but the great moon. However, as time passed, this doubt gradually dissipated instead. The reason was that the sacred power he gained through faith in the great moon was no different at all from the divine power traditionally obtained by worshipping Chironia. Even sacred relics bestowed in the goddess's name still shone brilliantly in his hands. All of this proved that the sacred power Lok now possessed was true power. So, with confusion, he asked the nun, "If that's the case, why make me believe in the moon?" Smiling, the nun gave her answer. "Faith comes from the intangible act of believing. But that kind of conviction often takes a long time to take root. In most cases, gaining trust from something you can see and touch is much easier. That is why I told you, the lofty goddess cannot be seen, but the great moon is always above our heads." These words made Lok suddenly understand. So that's how it is. The goddess's essence is the moon. This was a way to make those who harbored doubts more easily believe in a god with certainty. After completely clearing away all doubts in his heart, he offered the nun his deep thanks. The nun softly said, "If you wish to express your thanks, then pray with us instead. Many people have already gathered here." Lok nodded in agreement. "It would be my honor." The two of them pushed open the doors of the prayer chamber together. Inside, whether ordinary believers, young children, or practitioners, ascetics, and holy knights, all held their hands clasped and prayed in silence. And the nun walked slowly toward the center of the pulpit. With a calm smile, she spoke, "Then, let us pray together. Pray to the great moon." Under the moonlight cast in through stained glass, Yusha lifted her head, revealing those blood-red pupils. At this time, in the Palacio family, Alan held Yusha's letter and read it with his head lowered as he walked. What the letter contained was still just daily trifles, with nothing special on the surface. Being able to confirm that the 5 great sins were all doing well should have been good news, yet Alan still couldn't help letting out a soft sigh. Because other than Yusha, he hadn't received a single letter from any of the kids. That made him feel inexplicably lonely. But thinking carefully, he could understand it too. After all, he had never visited the orphanage even once, and naturally he had never truly met any one of the 5 great sins in person. To them, perhaps he was nothing more than a kind uncle far away in the heavens who occasionally lent a hand. In any case, he had now completed his original goal, guiding the 5 great sins onto the right path and stopping them from heading toward an ending where they destroyed the world. By rights, he had no need to feel unwilling to let these things go. However, the human heart is made of flesh, after all. Alan couldn't help but feel a trace of disappointment. Still, he soon put his gaze back on Yusha's letter. His face looked calm, but deep down a quiet sense of satisfaction surfaced. Because Yusha mailed a letter on time every month, that continuous concern made Alan's heart feel warm. He had worked hard to raise 5 kids, yet each and every one of them didn't know gratitude, too lazy even to write a letter, Only the eldest daughter seemed to know how hard an old father had it. That thought gave him an indescribable comfort. As expected, Yusha is the most considerate. Just as Alan was about to properly enjoy this care from his little padded jacket, Evan suddenly shoved the door open and rushed in, giving him a fright. It turned out the Intelligence Guild had delivered the latest news about the kids. Some people's intel didn't even need to be investigated on purpose, because the commotion had already become common knowledge, especially Deus and Seal Ring. Evan spoke first about Seal Ring. According to the intel, in order to challenge Baba Yaga, he had already achieved 32 consecutive wins in the 100 battles winning streak trial. This number left Alan finding it hard to believe, and he couldn't help asking, how far is his win streak record now from Colony's highest record? Then Evan immediately answered, so far, the gladiator who holds the highest win streak record in Colony is a man known as the Lion King. He set a record of 41 consecutive wins. This name felt inexplicably familiar to Alan. Isn't this the kind of temporary character from the game back then who suddenly joined your party, with combat power so outrageous it felt like cheats? Within the colony, all sorts of people mingled, yet hidden dragons and crouching tigers were everywhere. Countless powerful gladiators gathered there, and Colony's military strength was almost entirely built on these gladiators, to the point that the surrounding countries didn't dare act rashly. He hadn't expected Seal Rang to be so close to catching up to the peak of that era. Next, Evan brought news about Deus's Night Order. It was rumored that the Eclipse Night Order he led had successfully executed one of the 8 great chieftains of the barbarian tribes, Koga of the Snowfields. You had to know, those barbarian powerhouses were all monsters transformed through some bizarre ritual, long since far beyond the realm of normal people. In fact, even without Evan explaining further, Alan knew about the 8 great chieftains, because back in the game era, he had long known how absurd their combat power was. What made Alan even more uneasy was Ultorus, known as the Divine Descent Vessel. Once he fully awakened into a true divine avatar body, he would possess power enough to contend with the 5 great sins. Thinking of this, Alan couldn't help feeling a bit relieved. At least according to the original timeline, he wouldn't have to face such a monster personally. Ultorus would only appear after the 5 great sins descended. And now, Deus, who could kill one of the 8 great chieftains, someone even master-tier knights would struggle with, had already been regarded by the outside world as an existence that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the first swordsman, Reinhard. Hearing this, a thought suddenly rose in Alan's heart. Should I go see what they look like now in person? As he was thinking that, Evan was already talking about the next person, Rena. It was said that in the Labyrinth City, she was already able to inscribe relics with black inscriptions that could boost their abilities. However, what Alan truly cared about was still Haydn. Haydn couldn't really have gone and become a pirate king, right? Hearing this, Evan thought for a moment and answered, have you heard of the 7 islands off the coast of Raxus? They're the strongholds of 7 powerful pirate chiefs. It was said he had already successfully taken control of the largest of them, becoming that island's ruling captain. That single sentence scared Alan so badly he nearly dropped to his knees on the spot. He couldn't help recalling a post he had seen online long ago. A poor child continuously sponsored by a UN foundation for 8 years grew up and went to Somalia to become a pirate. He had never thought that the black humor joke he had once seen forwarded as a laugh would one day happen to him in such an absurd way. This was absolutely not his original intention in sending Haydn to Raxus. Haydn's perception was exceptionally outstanding, and he also carried the extremely rare sea god race bloodline. In the water, he was practically omnipotent, like a fish in water. With this perception talent, he could absolutely become a top-class treasure hunter, salvaging rare relics sleeping on the seabed of Raxus. This was also the career path Alan had designed for him. For that reason, he had even specially gifted Haydn an item specifically meant for perception. And now, here it was, he had actually become the strongest pirate across the 7 seas. A question suddenly popped into Alan's mind. How did Haydn take down the captain of the first island, anyway? You had to know, those pirate captains were almost invincible in naval battles. However, he quickly thought of the answer. Perhaps Haydn had fished up some particularly powerful things from ancient relics on the seabed. In order to obtain a certain artifact produced near Raxus's coasts, Alan had also once spent 3 days in the game crazily playing a treasure hunting mini-game, then used that artifact to crush the boss captain and brazenly seize his ship position. So beating the captain through equipment advantage and taking his position was, in a sense, entirely doable. Alan raised a hand and pressed at the corner of his eye. Of course he knew reality could not develop completely according to his script. But now, he was more like an old father who had worried himself sick over his children's futures. A massive sea city, the de facto heart of the Duchy of Korkia, Raxos. In the sea area in front of it, a pirate paradise made up of 7 islands lay scattered. Among them, the largest in scale was the first archipelago. Its former ruler was a great pirate who had exchanged sacrifices for the sea god's protection, known as the Red Slaughterer, Archlade. A pirate king almost invincible like that had now been defeated by a young man not yet 20. The young man looked down over the entire island. On the storm-howling sea surface, he lifted his eyes toward the distant sky, yet could not figure it out no matter what. What exactly was the Great Moon thinking? In fact, up to now, Haydn had never seriously thought about the essence of the Great Moon. At first, he had only treated it as a kind-hearted uncle, because he had originally been nothing more than a slave about to be used as biological experiment material and die in pain. Yet after meeting Yusha, he awakened his talent. Later, Blue Moon's actions, to him, were more like following Yusha's lead. So when he received his first order from the Great Moon, he instinctively felt strong resistance. He did not understand the meaning of that order. Like Seal rang before him, he did not understand. What use was becoming a treasure hunter, exactly? Toward this, he even felt a bit annoyed, because he had far too many targets he had to take revenge on. His life had originally belonged to a nameless small island. He had lived there quietly with his clan's people, far from the noise of the world. Until one day, a black thing suddenly descended and slaughtered everything to the last. He and his parents barely managed to flee to the continent, but when they were exhausted to the limit, they were attacked by a pack of damned hunters again. They killed his parents, who were already spent, and sold him into slavery. At that time, he swore he would complete his revenge in this life no matter what. Under circumstances like these, the identity of a treasure hunter meant nothing to him, let alone the fact that the gift from the Great Moon looked like it had nothing to do with revenge. Yet he still had to pretend to obey the order. Until that day, when he saw a noisy ship. At first, he only took that loud bunch for ordinary pirates. Not until they used the power of the sea god race on the deck. One of them claimed this was a blessing only those who offer sacrifices to the sea god are qualified to obtain. At that moment, Haydn realized, these people in front of him were the culprits who had killed his parents. They had not only slaughtered the sea god race's village, they had now even seized the power that originally belonged to the sea god race for themselves, then wrapped it in a false outer layer of sea god's blessing. In fact, the reason the sea god race could use that power was through the sacred right bestowed by the sea god they believed in, Clyad. And now, every pirate captain of the Seven Seas was using this stolen power. At the moment he became aware of the truth, anger, ecstasy, and an indescribable confusion intertwined into one. Although since being rescued and in every Blue Moon operation afterward he had never mentioned his past, at that moment he had an almost frightening intuition, as if the Great Moon had long since paved the road for him. As though, in order to fulfill a promise, it had deliberately handcrafted a perfect opportunity for revenge for him. Even so, he could not act immediately. Because those pirate captains all wielded the power of the sea god race, with his strength at the time, he was far from enough. So Haydn began to think calmly. Since all of this was arranged in advance, then the gift bestowed upon him must have its use. So, without hesitation, he leapt from the towering cliff. After swimming only a short distance in the seawater, that gift began to take effect. Seawater surged and gathered before his eyes, eventually Nintia into a pair of transparent goggles. That was the gift bestowed upon him by the Great Moon, Emrita's goggles. It possessed an extremely special ability. It could easily see large quantities of ancient artifacts sleeping on the seabed. Relying on this gift, Haydn successfully found several special relics, using them to make up for the gap in his raw strength. At the instant he truly understood this gift, Haydn understood one thing. Simply saying thank you was truly too foolish. The Great Moon not only kept its promise, placing what it should have promised him right before his eyes. It even additionally bestowed upon him the power that would let him take revenge. He also finally saw the other meaning hidden in that letter. The moon's true intent was for him to take revenge, and seize the ruling power of the Seven Islands. At this moment, he couldn't help recalling a line that girl often kept on her lips. Everything is for the Great Moon. That sentence had once been only a hollow slogan, but now, within his heart, it was gradually igniting into a radiance close to fanatic faith. Haydn lifted his head and looked at the moon, half of it sunk below the horizon. After that, about 3 months passed. The forest was then with autumn colors, and Alan boarded a carriage, setting out on the journey to Duke Roteger's biennial ambassador church assembly. The jolting wheels left him exhausted all over. If only I didn't have to go. Even though, he still entrusted himself to the carriage. After all, in Astria, all nobles had to attend this biennial ambassador church assembly. This was explicitly stipulated. Before long, 2 more carriages, one after another, pulled alongside their convoy. They were the convoys of the other 2 nobles scheduled to rendezvous with them. Whenever Archbishop season arrived, there were always some greedy mercenaries or bandits who set their sights on nobles, so the nobles would gather together from the start, to make those blind robbers give up even the thought of getting close. And Alan, of course, joined this group that set out from the east. Everything was safe and sound during the day. The real problem arose at night. By the campfire, the other 2 nobles couldn't help but sneer. So you're Count Palacio, yet you've only got a single guard? Isn't that a bit too shabby? Could it be that after inheriting the title, you can barely keep your finances afloat? In fact, what Alan truly dreaded was never mountain bandits or thieves, but people like these, who like to wag tongues behind others' backs. Starting from his grandfather's generation, House Palacio had been notorious. Their military force, from that time on, had been regarded as a dark and evil power, and they had never stopped infiltrating and controlling the eastern underworld. But ever since Alan took over as Count, in these past few years, House Palacio had stayed its hand, and it had even drawn a clear line with the underworld. Precisely because of that, those jackals long suppressed by Palacio, who could only gnaw on scraps at the margins, began to cast their eyes on this loosened territory. One by one, all of them planned to seize the chance to get a share. And because of Alan's apparent inaction, the rumor that he only became Count because he got lucky spread more and more as if it were true. As time passed, the rumor was simply treated as fact. So the outside world's evaluation of him gradually shifted from the behind-the-scenes mastermind who controls everything to a lucky idiot youngster pushed onto the stage by his family. Alan hadn't expected that these people wouldn't only gossip behind his back, but would even deliberately come mock him to his face. He lifted his eyes to those two nobles whose faces practically had the words "punch me" written on them, and couldn't help complaining inwardly, wasn't this a bit too much? But soon, he realized something. They were probably members of the Victims of House Palacio Association. From the family crest printed on those two carriages, these two were respectively from the Count of Kryld's house and the Count of Adorn's house, families that had long been treated like soft persimmons to be squeezed by House Palacio. But at their age, still playing this kind of low-level revenge, didn't they find it childish? Besides, the one who bullied you back then wasn't me. It felt a bit like those hecklers he used to see online in his previous life. In reality, they didn't dare make a sound, but once online they started spraying hatred at their father's enemies and throwing in greetings to the whole family. Evan at the side couldn't help sighing as well. After all these years, they're still throwing tantrums like children. Toward these two men's childish provocation, Alan chose to ignore them outright. Evan, very tactfully, handed over roasted corn he had brought from the kitchen. On a slightly chilly night like this, taking a bite of hot roasted corn was practically salvation. As for the chattering noise from those two nobles beside him, Alan simply treated it as background sound. Meanwhile, in the northern frontier, that wasteland long shrouded in extreme cold, seemed as if cursed. Upon the pale earth, there was almost no sign of life. In this cruel winter, a man struggled to crawl up from the snow. At his right arm, there was already nothing left. He was one of the barbarian tribe's great chieftains, Great Klecken. At this moment, after losing to the despicable and shameless Caliban Night Order, he waited alone for death to arrive. What enraged Klecken was not defeat itself. To the battle-worshipping barbarians, dying on the battlefield should have been an honor. What truly ignited his fury was that this death held no honor at all. He had actually fallen for the trick of the knight who had proactively challenged him to a duel. Klecken spat out a mouthful of blood. His vision grew ever more blurred, and his body gradually could no longer hold itself up. Even so, he was still unwilling. He could not accept that he would die in such a vile and humiliating way. This ending, this conclusion, made it hard for him to let go even as he closed his eyes. Thinking of his clansmen who had been humiliated just like him, blood tears slowly slid down from the corners of his eyes. And so, the body that should have gradually frozen in the cold wind, and the consciousness that was about to dissipate, at this moment seemed to be rekindled again. He braced himself on the ground and straightened up once more. His mouth kept murmuring, "We dare to call upon your noble name." Like an incantation, he softly chanted it again and again. Immediately after, in the gloomy sky, a gigantic phantom silently surfaced. That existence had already fallen into an outer god. As it looked down upon this icy earth, the corners of its mouth slowly curled into a smile. During the journey that followed, those two nobles still tirelessly mocked Alan with cold sarcasm. Even as other nobles joined the group one after another, they never restrained themselves. Faced with this situation, Alan had only one response: ignore it. After all, he had surfed the internet for years in his previous life, and had long since carved one principle into his bones: don't feed idiots. So at least here and now, no one could truly shake his mindset. Night fell, and the group made camp in an open area. However, the two men who had been speaking without restraint along the way, the Count of Kryld and the Count of Adorn, were in a foul mood at this time. Full of pent-up anger, they complained that Alan dared to ignore them, that it was an enormous rudeness toward them. But this annoyance only lasted a moment before Kryld lowered his voice and asked Adorn beside him, "You're sure you checked everything?" Adorn nodded and replied that he had already used one of his family's divine artifacts to detect the area. Here, apart from that brat who didn't know his place, and that vagrant knight who always stuck to him and even ate at the same table as nobles, there really were no other guards. Looks like the rumors are probably true. If he were really that strong, there's no way he'd travel with only one guard. Then we can start carrying out the plan. In fact, their open mockery of Alan along the way, and venting their resentment, had only been incidental. the more important purpose was to use this method to confirm how much guard strength he actually had. And the reason they had set their sights on Alan was because they wanted to seize the chance to insert themselves into the eastern underworld and take control of the enormous wealth and power there. At the thought that House Palacio might truly be nothing but an empty shell, KRYLD and Adorn could hardly suppress their excitement. Maybe the goddess of fortune has finally opened her arms to us. Just as they were brewing their conspiracy, an unusual sound suddenly came from the darkness. This sudden noise made the guards on watch all look in the same direction, their hands unconsciously reaching for their weapons. Then, a great swarm of black shadows burst out of the woods. The guards immediately rushed to the noble's front, spread out a defensive line, and shouted for the mages to cast illumination. Hearing that, the mage in the party raised his staff, and a ball of light shot up into the sky. At the instant the light exploded, the figures lurking in the night were completely lit up. When they saw those short bodies clearly, quite a few people let out a small sigh of relief. They were just a few goblins, that was all. To any mercenary with even a little experience, goblins, common forest trash mobs, posed no threat at all. However, the mage continued to release several more light orbs. As more light burst in midair, they finally saw clearly. The number of goblins far exceeded a normal scale, enough already to pose a lethal danger to an entire knight and mercenary convoy. But what made them even more terrified was not only the number. These goblins were obviously completely different from ordinary individuals. Almost everyone responsible for the outer perimeter watch was already dead. No one understood how this had happened at all, and when they saw what the monsters looked like, their spines chilled in unison. Those goblins, one after another, had grotesquely twisted bodies, their entire forms covered in purple crystals, from limbs to torso. Even their heads were sheathed in protruding crystal. They seemed to have been thoroughly contaminated by some kind of evil magic. In the next instant, the mutant goblin horde let out a piercing roar and charged the human line without regard for anything. Mercenaries and knights were forced to raise their weapons and hastily form ranks to meet them. At this moment, the ground at the center of the goblin horde suddenly churned violently, and a heavy stone wall formed of rock and rubble rose from the earth, stretching between the monsters and the humans. Some of the mutant goblins at the very front were immediately skewered through by sharp rock spurs and nailed straight onto the stone wall. Right after, a half-transparent light curtain rose up from the ground, covering most of the mutant goblins within. After the mage who had cast the illumination spell blanked for an instant, he abruptly reacted. This stone wall was the Tier 3 magic wall of rock, and that light curtain covering the whole area was the Tier 2 magic shield. In other words, there was another mage in the party whom they had never even noticed. Just as he was puzzled, a calm and low voice sounded in the darkness. Compression. The rock began to rumble once more. The area enclosed by the stone wall and the light curtain suddenly contracted. That light curtain looked as if it were being slowly squeezed by an invisible hand, until at last it twisted all mutant goblins and Sishu within together into a gigantic spherical mass, which rose up from the ground. When the dust and smoke cleared, the no-man's land that had stood between humans and monsters was now a gigantic crater. Everyone looked in the direction of the voice, only to see Count Palacio, Alan, strolling out of the shadows. Vacuum. He raised one hand, and his fingertips clenched lightly. In the next moment, he spat out another word, primal return. As that final phrase fell, the bracelet on his wrist flashed with a faint layer of gray light. Up in the air, that sphere formed by the compression and distortion of rock and the light curtain suddenly exploded like a blast of grapeshot detonated in midair, showering shard-like stone chunks and energy fragments downward at extremely high speed in a slanted sweep across the mutant goblin horde. In the blink of an eye, dozens of goblins caught in the strike were all torn to pieces. This entire process lasted only an instant. Before they could even fully understand what had happened, everyone could only stare blankly at the monster corpses twisted into a mess of flesh and purple crystal fragments, their mouths opening reflexively, yet not a single word coming out. At this moment, everyone's gaze inevitably focused on the same person, Alan. He calmly withdrew his extended right hand, lifted his head slightly, and his level voice once again broke the silence. This time, his words were like some kind of signal, making every knight and mercenary snap awake as if from a dream and raise their weapons by reflex. The fear hidden deep in their hearts had, at some point, already quietly dispersed, like mist blown away by the wind. Ahead, Alan stood firmly in the rear ranks, repeatedly casting magic to pin down the enemy. Those empowered goblins, still charging stubbornly, were pierced one after another by the sharp stone pillars he summoned, and nailed to the ground. Evan stood at his side, using smooth, decisive swordsmanship to block every enemy that tried to approach him. In an extremely short time, the battle situation completely tipped. With the two of them supporting the line, the convoy actually suffered almost no major casualties. When a knight's longsword fully pierced through the skull of the last goblin still struggling on its last breath, this sudden, brutal battle finally came to an end. Several nobles in the rear also poked their heads out and looked toward the front line. After letting out a long breath, almost all the combatants turned around at the same time. They looked in unison toward the same spot. There stood Alan, who had just flipped the battle back from the brink of death, and yet still wore a calm expression, as if nothing had happened at all. Facing this powerful and composed mage, what surged in their hearts was only instinctive awe. No one knew that at this moment, Alan, standing at the center of everyone's gaze, had a faint aftershock of fear deep inside. That was close. I almost got taken away. Although he wore the Tainted One's bracelet, letting him cast 3 or 4 more times than an ordinary mage, in a high-intensity fight like that, his mana had still nearly run dry by the midpoint, and he had once again become a complete ordinary person. Even with Evan guarding him at his side the whole time, he still felt lingering fear at that instant of powerlessness. I was even thinking earlier, just because they were too noisy, that I wanted to swallow those 2 guys on the spot. As expected, it's safer to act honestly and stick with the main group. After steadying the heart that was still fluttering a little, Alan withdrew his gaze with a serious face and instead stared at the mutant goblin corpses. He knew all too well what the purple crystals growing on these goblins represented. What he didn't understand was, why would divine descent appear here? So-called divine descent was an anomalous phenomenon that accompanied an outer god's imminent invasion of this world. Once affected by divine descent, monsters would become more violent, and at the same time gain obvious reinforcement in their bodies and in every aspect of their abilities. By rights, none of this should have happened. Those outer gods beyond the boundary should, in principle, only have the chance to cross over and invade after the 5 great sins awakened and descended and the world's laws collapsed. However, the appearance of this divine descent phenomenon before his eyes meant that the timing of the outer god's arrival had been brought forward. Clearly the kids of the 5 great sins haven't awakened yet. So why has it turned out like this? Where exactly went wrong? To Alan, this was something he absolutely could not ignore. He immediately made a decision in his heart. Once he reached the destination, the first thing he would do was find a way to gather intelligence. And at this moment, his cold and deep expression happened to be seen from afar by Count Kryld and Count Adorn, making the 2 men's hearts jolt, their whole bodies turning cold. The next day, at Duke Roteger's estate, Alan and his group finally arrived at their destination. The constant jolting along the way, plus last night's life and death battle, left him so exhausted he only wanted to turn around and head straight home. At this moment, the only wish in his mind was, hurry up and get it over with. Hurry up and go home. The instant he stepped into the ballroom, he was briefly stunned by the scene before him. From the carpet to the chandeliers, the entire hall reeked of naked money. Even the most inconspicuous wine cup had a rim inlaid with gold. If someone quietly pried off a piece and took it away right now, as long as they were quick enough, no one would probably notice immediately. Just then, a voice with a fawning tone reached his ears. Duke Roteger is truly impressive. He looked in the direction of the voice and saw several nobles gathered around Duke Roteger, smiling as they exchanged pleasantries while piling up all kinds of flattering praise. But this time, Alan didn't deliberately take the initiative to greet other nobles the way he had last time. Right now, he only wanted to keep a comfortable, safe distance from everyone. His thoughts had barely drifted when they were interrupted by 2 cautious voices. Greetings, Count Palacio. Might you spare us the honor of meeting with us when you have a moment? This is the finest meat produced in our territory. Would you like to try some, my lord? And also, we'd like to provide some financial support to your territory. What do you think? Alan froze for an instant. Weren't these 2 the very guys who had been mocking him with sarcasm all along the road? Why had their attitudes suddenly become so humble and courteous? However, in their eyes, Alan's still expressionless face at this moment seemed to have turned slightly gloomy. That illusion instantly frightened them, pale, trembling all over, regret practically spilling out of their eyes. In fact, ever since last night's battle with the mutated goblins ended, the unimaginable strength Alan had displayed had already terrified the 2 counts to the core. Was that really magic? They couldn't believe what they had witnessed, so they immediately borrowed the Tier 3 mage Baron Allman had brought along to show off. In front of that utterly bewildered mage, the 2 hurriedly asked whether he recognized the spell Alan had just cast. Was it some kind of variant of Tier 2 magic? Hearing that question, the Tier 3 mage Baron Allman had hired was written all over with confusion. That is absolutely impossible as Tier 2 magic. Because the power that spell displayed easily surpassed me. It is at least a Tier 3 or higher formula. Hearing this judgment, Kryld and Adorn instantly understood. Those outside rumors about a good-for-nothing boy who became a count by luck were pure fabrication. Even more frightening was that they finally truly understood why Count Palacio had traveled with almost no guards. It was because he didn't need them at all. And that meant that the terrifying power rumored to be capable of erasing Avalon in a single day very likely was not an exaggeration. Thus, the only conclusion they drew was, they had to placate Alan's emotions as quickly as possible and use every means to curry favor with him. Maybe then they could even keep their own lives. Watching the 2 of them fluster in frantic obsequiousness, Evan couldn't help muttering, what exactly are they trying to do? Alan gave a slight sigh. He knew perfectly well, he had been misunderstood again. Evan quietly asked him whether they should deal with the 2 of them cleanly. Alan only replied, pretending to be full of imposing presence, "I'll handle it myself." As soon as the words fell, the two counts' knees went limp and they dropped to the floor with a thud. Having long been oppressed by House Palacio, they understood better than anyone how brutal that family was. So even a casual, flat remark from Alan was enough to scare them into a cold sweat. After arranging for Evan to contact the Intelligence Guild, Alan planned to grab something simple to eat in the hall first, and also listen to what the surrounding nobles were talking about. Before long, he noticed two nobles not far away who seemed to be having some kind of secret conversation. Though the distance wasn't close, it wasn't a problem for him. With hearing enhanced by mana, he easily caught the details of that conversation. From it, he heard a rather interesting piece of news. It said that Duke Altea not only formed an alliance with the Count of Zenonia, but also plans to form a new faction. They say the strength of this new faction will be so great it can overwhelm all existing factions. Listening, Alan felt a bit surprised, but his face showed no grimness at all. Even if the information was true, he still didn't believe the two people stirring up storms behind the scenes would maintain this alliance for long. He lightly bit into the egg tart in his hand. The crust was toasted, fragrant, and crisp. The inside was soft and dense. The sweetness was just right, so much so that for an instant he almost forgot he was on a political stage, not at some culinary gathering. Just then, the two men's conversation drifted into his ears again. However, the true leader of this new faction is neither Duke Altea nor the Count of Zenonia. The real head is Count Palacio. Those words hit Alan like a bolt from the blue as he was savoring his food. The half-eaten egg tart in Alan's hand fell straight to the floor. His mind was instantly flooded with enormous question marks. What kind of nonsense is this? He carefully ran through his social history and only remembered having met the current Duke of Altea once at the previous ball. As for the Count of Zenonia, he didn't even know what the man looked like. He had only seen his daughter twice in different settings. He couldn't understand at all how such an outrageous rumor had been fabricated and spread. As he was thinking, he suddenly heard someone call his name. "Count Palacio, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Carmine, the third son of Duke Marlin of the Kingdom of Ashutalen." Alan paused slightly, searched through his memory, and found no information about this person at all. Even so, out of courtesy, he prepared to give a brief self-introduction. He had barely begun when Carmine suddenly changed tone, his face turning sullen, and said coldly, "I've heard you became a count by luck. I just wanted to see what kind of person you really are. Is there some trick to it?" Alan froze. He hadn't expected the other party to mock him so directly to his face, completely like an idiot who'd left home without a brain. However, before he could respond, another voice heavy with pressure cut into the conversation coldly. "What did you mean by what you just said? Are you mocking the nobles of our kingdom of Asteria?" Carmine's face changed, and he hurriedly explained that he absolutely hadn't meant anything like that. In fact, he had traveled all this way to Asteria in order to marry Duke Roteger's youngest daughter. He had always been extremely confident in his looks and background, believing no woman would refuse him. But this self-satisfied fool had, in front of the other party, publicly critiqued the appearances of other nobles. Calling such behavior trampling noble upbringing underfoot would not be an exaggeration. Duke Roteger's youngest daughter naturally felt nothing but disgust for him, and without hesitation, rejected the marriage on the spot. Even more ridiculous was that Carmine had no idea at all why his marriage had suddenly been cancelled. In this foul mood, he happened to see Count Palacio. Before setting out, he had heard that Asteria had a black-haired, black-eyed Count Palacio, nothing more than a hot-headed youngster who had climbed into his title by luck. So he urgently needed a target to vent on. And to him, this noble who rose by luck was the perfect target. Who would have thought that the moment the words left his mouth, what awaited him was a round of harsh reprimands from three heavyweight nobles. Even though Alan had little interest in power, he could not possibly fail to recognize who these three were. First, one of the initiators of this banquet, a backbone figure of the noble faction, Duke Roteger. Second, an important pillar of the royalist faction, Marquis Mardanio. Finally, a highly weighty figure in the neutral faction, Count Palin. These three held extremely high prestige and influence within the Kingdom of Asteria. "The Kingdom of Ashutalen has always been our ally of many years," Duke Roteger said in a deep voice. "Does your behavior represent your kingdom's attitude, and Duke Marlin himself's stance toward us?" Carmine hurriedly waved his hands, stammering that he absolutely didn't mean that. Count Palin followed up immediately, pressing step by step. "If so, then what reason do you have to speak such disrespectful words to a count?" Carmine had just tried to explain that he had merely been discourteous for a moment when Marquis Mardanio coldly added another blow. Discourtesy itself is a small matter. The real question is, what gives you the right to speak to Count Palacio in that kind of contemptuous tone? The surrounding nobles crowded in, and sets of questioning and accusations, familiar beyond familiarity, were thrown out one after another from different mouths. That atmosphere gave Alan an intense sense of déjà vu. He lagged a beat and suddenly realized, Isn't this the wheel-style interrogation I used to see all the time back in the army? More than 10 years had passed, yet that kind of scene was still clearly branded deep in his memory. He even unconsciously broke into a thin sweat. Under the pincer attack of the 3 heavyweight nobles, Carmine ultimately couldn't withstand the pressure and fled the ballroom in near panic. And the nobles left behind, almost at the same time, gathered toward Alan as if they had been waiting a long time, scrambling to strike up conversation with him. Those nearby who had already been watching the commotion saw these 3 important figures act together and immediately defaulted to the earlier rumor that he is the new faction's leader, most likely true. Thanks to Alan's many-enhanced hearing, he clearly heard the surrounding nobles' whispered murmurs. Only then did he roughly piece together how that outrageous rumor had been embellished layer by layer, magnified, and then fixed in place. He was hesitating over whether to find an opportunity to explain things to these 3 nobles who were actively pretending intimacy, clarifying that the so-called new faction led by him was nothing but baseless talk. Just then, Marquis Mardenio spoke first. He said he had heard Alan had recently been researching magic, and that in the last campaign to subjugate the beast men, he had obtained from the seized holy objects a relic that could store and release mana, and he especially wished to gift it to Alan. The other 2 likewise stated that each of them also had a gift they wished to present. Faced with one magical holy object after another and precious tools being handed to him, the explanation Alan had been about to say wavered, and then was quietly swallowed back down. In the end, he still couldn't resist the temptation and accepted 2 magical holy objects and 5 bottles of mana recovery potion from the 3 nobles. Night fell, in an auxiliary building of Duke Roteger's estate. Inside a dimly lit room, a woman sat upright in a chair and asked Marquis Mardenio, who stood before her, in a flat tone, "How did things go?" Marquis Mardenio showed a bit of relief and answered respectfully, "Reporting to you, my lady, he has accepted our gifts." Gift-giving among nobles was ordinary enough. But when the recipient became the leader of a faction, and the gifts were upgraded to important divine artifact level items, the meaning represented by the gesture went far beyond simple social favors. Hearing this result, the woman opposite revealed a hint of a smile. "It's wonderful to know he is willing to accept my lord's gifts," Marquis Mardenio quickly said modestly. "All of this was thanks to the thorough arrangements of Her Grace, the Duchess of Altia." The woman nodded lightly, then spoke in a tone as if declaring the start of a new phase. "Then welcome to formally join our side, Marquis Mardenio. Next, let us advance together, for our shared goal." Her name was Loria.